She stood in front of 200 cameras, microphones pointed at her face like weapons, and she smiled the smile of someone who had never once been wrong. I would never build a future with a man who already has children. The words landed clean and sharp, the kind of statement that fills a headline in under 3 seconds. What she didn't know was that 12 feet above her head, a man on a maintenance ladder had heard every word. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop his wrench. He simply kept working. And that quiet moment would change everything. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this goes. Hit like, stay until the end. This one's worth it. The Kensington name carried weight in Charleston the way old money always does. Not loudly, not with flash, but with the kind of settled permanence that makes newer wealth feel nervous at dinner parties. The shipping empire had been built by Avery's grandfather, expanded by her father, and inherited by Avery herself at 26 when Raymond Kensington suffered a stroke that left him able to move his left hand and not much else. 4 years later, Kensington Maritime Holdings occupied the top 3 floors of a building on the waterfront, employed over 4,000 people across 11 states, and generated revenue numbers that made financial journalists reach for superlatives they'd already used on other companies. Avery ran it. Not in the ceremonial way that some heiresses run things, the ribbon cutting, the charity galas, the quarterly appearances on panels about women in leadership. She ran it the way her grandfather had, by showing up first and leaving last, by reading every contract herself, by making calls at 6 in the morning to port managers who thought she wouldn't know what they were trying to hide. She was 30 years old, and she had not taken a vacation in 2 years. She had also not been on a second date in longer than that, a fact her assistant, Margot, brought up with the subtlety of someone dropping a brick on a glass table. "You're booked for the Meridian Hotel press conference at 2, Margot said, walking half a step behind Avery down the corridor on the 28th floor. She was 43, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had worked for the Kensington family since Avery was in college. The renovation announcement, ballroom, catering, the usual setup. "I know what a press conference is, Margot. I'm also putting Dr. Lena Park's number in your calendar." Avery didn't slow down. "Who is Dr. Lena Park?" "A therapist. Very well reviewed. Specializes in high-functioning people who've forgotten they're also human beings." "That's not a specialty." "I described you to her and she said, and I'm quoting directly here, 'Oh, I know exactly what that is.'" Avery stopped walking. She turned and looked at Margot with the particular expression she reserved for proposals that required a firm and final number. Margot looked back at her with the particular expression she reserved for things she had already decided were happening. "Cancel the therapist," Avery said. "I haven't booked her yet." "Then don't." She turned and kept walking. The Meridian Hotel had been a Charleston institution for 60 years before Kensington Maritime acquired it 18 months ago as part of a larger portfolio deal. The renovation plan, $12 million, 18 months, a complete restoration of the original 1960s ballroom while modernizing the mechanical infrastructure, was the kind of project that generated goodwill and press coverage in equal measure. Avery had approved it without hesitation. What she had not approved, and what she noticed the moment she stepped into the ballroom at 1:47 p.m., was the state of the chandelier. The Meridian's main ballroom chandelier was a 1963 original, 700 individual crystals, hand-cut, suspended on a custom brass armature 12 feet above the center of the room. It had appeared in 3 films, 2 magazine spreads, and 1 extremely dramatic episode of a true crime documentary that had nothing to do with the hotel. It was, by any measure, the most photographed object in the building. It was also missing 4 bulbs on its eastern arc, and 2 of the crystal drops were hanging at wrong angles, which meant someone had recently touched it without reading the restoration specifications. She clocked this from 20 feet away while shaking hands with the hotel's interim manager, a nervous man named Gerald who kept touching his collar. "The chandelier," she said, not as a question. Gerald looked up. "Yes, we have someone on it. Actually, he's up there right now. We wanted to have it looking correct before the press conference that starts in 13 minutes. "Yes, exactly. So, who approved touching the chandelier before I reviewed the restoration report?" Gerald's collar got another visit from his fingers. "That would have been, the facilities coordinator. He assessed it this morning and felt the bulb replacement was straightforward enough to bow. The crystal mounts are original brass fittings from 1963. Straightforward is not a word I would use. She looked up. The man on the ladder was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected exactly. Someone younger, maybe. Someone who looked apologetic. Gerald had the apologetic thing covered for the whole building, so perhaps that wasn't fair. What she saw was a man in his early 30s, work pants, a gray shirt with the Meridian Maintenance logo on the chest, moving with the kind of careful deliberateness that people who know what they're doing move with. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't performing competence for the crowd below. The press corps was already filing in at the back of the room, and he seemed entirely uninterested in them. He was holding a replacement bulb in one hand and a small reference card in the other, and he was reading the card before he touched anything. He had the reference specifications. She noted that, filed it somewhere. "What's his name?" she asked Gerald. "Pierce, Landon Pierce. He's been with the Meridian Facilities team for about 8 months. Before that, I think he was... Honestly, I'm not sure. He came very well recommended." "From where?" I'd have to check." She was going to check. Later. Right now, the room was filling up. The press conference went the way they always went. Avery stood at the podium in a charcoal blazer that cost more than most people's rent, gave a prepared statement about the hotel's history and Kensington's commitment to preservation, answered 3 questions about timeline and budget, deflected 2 questions about her personal life with the practiced ease of someone who had been deflecting those questions since she was 27, and a financial magazine put her on their cover with the headline, "The Heiress Running Daddy's Empire," or something more. She had framed that cover and put it in the company bathroom on the 28th floor. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of what she was still up against. Then a reporter in the 3rd row, young, eager, the kind who still thought the unexpected question was a journalism strategy, rather than a fast way to get blacklisted from future events, raised his hand and asked something that had nothing to do with the hotel. "Ms. Kensington, you've been pretty outspoken in past interviews about your personal priorities. With the company expanding and your profile growing, is marriage something you're thinking about? A family?" The room shifted. A few of the more experienced journalists grimaced slightly, the way people do when they watch someone touch a hot stove. Avery didn't grimace. She smiled. Not warmly, but precisely. "I think my personal life is a separate conversation from a renovation announcement," she said. "Of course," the reporter said, not backing down. "But you've said publicly before that you have a very specific vision for what a partner would look like. Do you still hold that view?" She should have ended it there. She knew how to end things there. She'd done it 100 times. But something in the room, some combination of the lights and the long day and the 2 other questions she'd just handled that both had the faint smell of disrespect, something made her answer instead of redirect. "My view hasn't changed," she said. "I have a very full life and very specific priorities. If I were ever to consider a serious relationship, it would be with someone who could match that. Someone without complicated prior obligations. I wouldn't build a future with a man who already has children. That's not the foundation I'm looking for. Clean, direct, final." She had said versions of this before in smaller rooms, and it had never caused problems. It was her life, her standards. She was allowed to have them. What she hadn't calculated was the acoustics of the room, or the angle of the cameras, or the fact that the maintenance ladder was positioned exactly 12 feet behind her left shoulder, inside the frame of every camera that was pointed at the podium. And on that ladder, Landon Pierce had gone very still. He finished the bulb. He checked the crystal mount, the one that had been hanging at the wrong angle, and corrected it with a small, careful adjustment using a tool the size of a pen. He returned the reference card to his chest pocket. He climbed down the ladder 1 rung at a time, the way he always climbed down, without hurrying. He folded the ladder. He carried it to the service corridor. He signed out at the facilities log at 2:34 p.m. He drove home. He picked up his son from the neighbor's apartment on the 2nd floor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Okafor, who watched Noah on days when Landon's shift ran long. Noah was 5, and he was in the middle of explaining something about dinosaurs with the urgent breathless energy of someone delivering critical information. And the T-Rex didn't actually have good eyesight, Dad. It mostly used smell. That's why it couldn't see the guy when he was standing still in the movie. Except actually, that's not totally accurate either because, "You ate dinner?" Landon asked Mrs. Okafor over Noah's head. "Mac and cheese, 2 servings. She gave him a look that contained several unspoken things. "You had a long day." "Normal day." She gave him the look again. He thanked her, took Noah's hand, and went upstairs. He didn't check his phone until Noah was asleep. By then, the clip had been viewed 400,000 times. The clip was 12 seconds long. It showed Avery Kensington at the podium, saying the words clearly, and then, in the background, in focus, because the cameras had good lenses, Landon Pierce on the ladder, going still for exactly 2 seconds, and then slowly, deliberately, continuing his work. No reaction, no expression, no dropped tools, no turned head, no moment of obvious emotion. Just a man who heard something hard and kept doing his job. The internet, which had developed a refined sensitivity to certain kinds of dignity, lost its mind. He heard every word and didn't even flinch. That's a real man. The look on his face, which was no look at all, said everything. Single dads? 1. Billionaire heiresses? 0. I need to know everything about the man on the ladder. By midnight, it was at 2 million views. By morning, it was everywhere. Morning shows, social media, opinion columns with headlines like, "What the Man on the Ladder Taught Us All," and less charitably toward Avery, "Billionaire heir makes case for why she's still single." Avery read none of it until Margot put a printed summary on her desk at 7:15 a.m. with a single sticky note on top that said, "We need to talk." "How bad?" Avery asked. "Define bad." Margot sat down across from her. She had brought 2 coffees, which meant the conversation was going to take a while. How bad in terms of actual impact? Not sentiment, not Twitter, actual impact. The board has seen it. Harrington called this morning, not officially just to check in, but we both know what that means. 3 interview requests from major outlets, one of which was framed as an opportunity for you to clarify your comments. Margot made small quotation marks in the air. And the communications team is asking for direction. Direction being, whether we ignore it, whether we issue a statement, or whether you do something. Avery picked up the coffee. It was the right temperature, which meant Margot had timed it, which meant she'd been thinking about this conversation since before 7. What does do something look like? Reach out to the man, privately, acknowledge that the moment was awkward. I was going to say inadvertently public in a way that reflected on him without his consent. That's a lot of words for awkward. It's also more accurate. Avery set the coffee down. She had spent the night not sleeping particularly well, which she would not admit, and turning the moment over in her mind the way you turn something over when you're trying to convince yourself it's less significant than it feels. She had said what she believed. She still believed it, technically, in the abstract way that you believe a principle until the principle walks into a specific room and becomes a specific person. The problem wasn't what she'd said. The problem was that a man she didn't know had been quietly, competently doing his job in the background of her statement, and the contrast between her certainty and his silence had told a story she hadn't intended to tell. "What do we know about him?" she asked. Margot had a folder ready. Of course she did. Landon Pierce, 32, facilities manager, currently assigned to the Meridian renovation oversight. Single father, 1 child, a son named Noah, age 5. His wife, Kara Pierce, died 4 years ago. Margot paused briefly. Cardiac event. She was 27. Avery said nothing for a moment. Before the Meridian, he had a different career entirely. Margot turned a page. 7 years as a federal investigator, Financial Crimes Division. He was apparently quite good. Commendations. A regional citation for a case involving interstate fraud. He left the bureau 14 months after his wife died. To take care of his son. That's the reasonable inference. He hasn't given interviews. He doesn't appear to have social media. He's not seeking any of this attention. That was the part Avery kept coming back to. He wasn't seeking it. Most people, in that situation, publicly humiliated, however inadvertently, by a billionaire at a press conference, would have done something, talked to a reporter, posted something, let someone know they deserved better. He had driven home and picked up his kid. Set up a meeting, she said. Margot raised an eyebrow. With Pierce? Yes. He doesn't work for you directly. He's contracted through the Meridian Facilities team. Then arrange it through the Meridian. Tell Gerald. She paused. Don't make it official. Don't send lawyers or PR. Just arrange it. What do I tell him it's about? Avery thought about it. The chandelier. Margot stared at her. The restoration specifications, Avery said. I want to discuss the restoration specifications with the facilities team. That's true, by the way. I do want to discuss them. You want to discuss them with the entire team or with specifically Landon Pierce? Avery picked up the coffee again. Set up the meeting, Margot. He showed up in work clothes. She had half expected him to dress up, to turn it into a moment, a confrontation, something with weight and intention. She had prepared quietly for some version of a man who was angry or wounded or performatively dignified in the way the internet already thought he was. Instead, he walked into the small conference room on the second floor of the Meridian at 10 in the morning in the same gray work shirt, sat down across from her, and put a folded copy of the restoration specifications on the table. You wanted to discuss the specs, he said. His voice was even, not cold, just even. The voice of someone who had decided, before entering the room, exactly how much energy this situation was going to get. Avery had spent considerable time in boardrooms across from people who were trying to control situations. She recognized it, usually, immediately. This felt different. It didn't feel like control. It felt like conservation. Like a man who had learned, through some process she didn't have details on yet, to spend himself carefully. The crystal mounts, she said, because she had decided she was going to do this the honest way. The 1963 brass fittings. You had the reference card. I looked up the restoration specs before I touched anything, he said. The mounts were original. I wasn't going to improvise with original hardware. Gerald said it was a straightforward replacement. Something moved in his expression. Very brief. Gerald says a lot of things with a lot of confidence. Despite herself, Avery almost smiled. I noticed. A pause. Not uncomfortable, just present. That's not why you called this meeting, Landon said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. No, she said. It isn't. He waited. She had planned a careful, measured version of what she wanted to say. Something professional and appropriate and just warm enough to be human without being apologetic in a way that could be misread. What she actually said was, I didn't know you were there. He looked at her. I know. That's not an excuse. I want to be clear that I wasn't making a statement in your direction. I'm aware of that too. You seem very calm about something a lot of people are very worked up about on your behalf. He was quiet for a moment. He had large hands, she noticed, the kind that came from actual work, not the gym. One of them was resting on the table, and he was looking at the restoration specs rather than at her. I've heard worse things than someone saying they wouldn't date a man like me, he said finally, and I've had harder days than that one. He looked up. Are you here because the company's PR team told you this would help, or because you actually wanted to say something? The question landed clean. No hostility in it, but no softness either. Both, she said, because she had decided on honesty. I'm not going to pretend there isn't a business dimension to this. But I also... Yes, I wanted to say something. He nodded slowly, like he was filing it, evaluating it. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He sat back slightly. Okay. She waited for something more, an acceptance, a dismissal, some indication of what okay meant in the context of Landon Pierce's internal accounting system. It didn't come. Tell me about the chandelier, he said. The actual question, the specifications. And so she did. They talked for 40 minutes about a chandelier. It was not the strangest 40 minutes of Avery Kensington's professional life. That title belonged to a board meeting 3 years ago that had devolved into a screaming argument about whether the word synergy should be banned from company documents, but it was among the more unexpectedly interesting. He knew the hardware, not in a way that suggested he'd crammed the night before, but in the easy, lateral way that people know things they've actually thought about. He had questions about the sourcing plan for replacement crystal if any of the existing drops needed to be substituted. And they were good questions, specific enough to reveal that he'd read beyond the surface document. "You've worked in facilities for what, 8 months?" she said at one point. "At the Meridian, yeah." "Before that you were in—" She stopped herself. He looked at her steadily. "You know what I did before. I had Margot pull your background." "Right." He didn't look offended, just, again, even. "Federal investigator. Financial crimes. I left about 14 months after my wife died." "To raise your son." "Yes." She didn't say I'm sorry because she'd found over years of business that I'm sorry in professional contexts almost always landed wrong. Either too small for the grief it was addressing or presumptuous about an emotion the other person hadn't invited her into. She said, "That's a significant change." It was. He picked up his coffee. She'd had Margot bring coffee when she set up the room, a small decision she now wondered if he'd noticed. And he looked at the window for a moment. Charleston Harbor was visible from this floor, the water catching light. She was the planner. She had a 10-year plan for our life, a 5-year plan, a 1-year plan. She had a backup plan for the backup plan. Something in his voice shifted slightly and then returned. When she was gone, I didn't have a plan for anything, so I got a job that required me to show up and be useful and fix things that were broken. "That makes sense," Avery said. "It's not inspiring," he said. "People want it to be inspiring. The former federal agent who chose love over career, raising his son with one hand and a toolkit with the other." He set the coffee down. "It's just what I could manage. Most days I just try to make sure Noah eats breakfast and knows someone is coming home." Avery said nothing. She was looking at him in a way she wasn't used to looking at people in professional contexts. Not assessing, not calculating, just looking. "I should get back to the floor," he said, starting to rise. "I'd like to keep your team on the chandelier restoration," she said. "The full restoration, not just the bulb replacement, if you're willing." He paused, half out of the chair. "That's Gerald's call." "Gerald will do what I tell him." Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "Yeah, I've noticed that about Gerald." "Are you willing?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, like he was checking something. She didn't know what. "Yeah," he said. "I'm willing." She ran into him twice more in the next 10 days without having arranged it. Once in the hotel's service corridor, where she had gone to check on the mechanical system evaluation with the lead engineer, and he was reviewing a blueprint on a folding table, and looked up when she came around the corner with the expression of someone who had not expected to see her but was not particularly surprised either. "Ms. Kensington." "Pierce." She paused. The engineer was ahead of her, already at the mechanical room door. "How's the chandelier?" "Good. The east side mount needed a full bracket replacement. Period-appropriate hardware was harder to source than I expected." "Where'd you find it?" "Specialty supplier in Savannah. They do historical restoration work. Took some calls." He folded one corner of the blueprint. "It'll be right when we're done." "I know it will," she said, and kept walking. The second time was in the hotel's small courtyard, where she had gone at 7 in the morning because she had a call with a port manager in Portugal that had been rescheduled twice, and she needed air. He was there with a cup of coffee and a child's drawing, actual paper, colored pencil, that he was looking at with the expression of a man trying to decipher something important. She almost walked back inside. She didn't. "That from your son?" she asked. He looked up. "Yeah, he made it at Mrs. Okafor's yesterday. That's our neighbor. He turned it slightly so she could see. He says it's us at the beach. I'm the tall one. That's meant to be the ocean." The drawing was enthusiastic in the way that 5-year-old drawings are enthusiastic. The ocean was green. The tall figure had what appeared to be 7 fingers on one hand. "He's got your proportions right," Avery said. Landon looked at her. "The tall part," she said. He looked back at the drawing. "He's been asking about going to the beach. We went last summer before I took this job. He talks about it like it was 15 years ago. He set the coffee down. I keep telling him we'll go when I have a weekend free. When do you have a weekend free? A pause. I'll let you know when I find out. He said it without complaint, just fact. The coffee was getting cold and he didn't seem to notice, or had decided not to notice, which she was coming to understand was a different thing with him. She went inside to take her call. She thought about the drawing for most of the afternoon. 3 weeks after the press conference, Avery was in the financial records on the 28th floor at 11 p.m. when she found the first discrepancy. It wasn't dramatic. Financial discrepancies rarely are at first. They look like rounding errors, like data entry mistakes, like the kind of thing a tired accountant produces on a Thursday afternoon. A line in the maritime logistics contracts from 4 years ago where numbers had been adjusted post-signing. A vendor payment that appeared twice under slightly different vendor names, one of them misspelled. She almost passed it. She didn't pass it because her grandfather had taught her, when she was 12 years old, that the honest mistake and the dishonest mistake look identical until you pull the thread. Always pull the thread, Avery, even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. She pulled the thread. By midnight, she had 3 more discrepancies, all in a cluster around the same 18-month period 4 years ago, all of them touching the same set of contracts, all of them routed through Vincent Caldwell's division. Vincent Caldwell had been with Kensington Maritime for 22 years. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore pocket squares and remembered everyone's birthday and made every junior employee feel personally important. Her father had trusted him completely. Her grandfather had liked him. She had always liked him too, in the complicated way you like someone who makes you feel like you're inheriting something earned rather than something given. She closed the files at 12:30. She went home. She did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, she called Margot and said, I need someone who understands how financial fraud is constructed. Not our lawyers. They're too loud. Someone who can look at records quietly and tell me if what I'm seeing is what I think I'm seeing. Margot was quiet for a moment. I might know someone. She told herself it was a professional decision. She told herself this 3 times while dialing the number Margot had provided, and twice more while it rang, and once more when he picked up on the 3rd ring sounding like someone who had been awake for a while. Pierce? It's Avery Kensington. A pause. It's 6:40 in the morning. I know. I'm sorry. I have a professional question, and I've been told you have a background that makes you the right person to ask. Another pause. She could hear background sounds, something small and domestic, a cabinet maybe. Morning sounds. Margot told you. She said you were very well regarded in financial crimes. She said that. She did. He was quiet for a moment. The cabinet sound again, and then, she thought, a child's voice, very briefly, in the background, then quieter. What kind of records? He asked. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The kind that have been carefully adjusted, over time, in a pattern I can't fully interpret on my own. How long ago? The cluster starts about 4 years back. How much are we talking about in terms of exposure? I don't know yet. Enough that I'm calling a facilities manager at 6:40 in the morning. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Not quite. Send me what you can tonight. Anything that doesn't require me to have clearances I don't have anymore. He paused. And Avery. She registered that he'd used her name. Yes? If this is what it sounds like, if there's a pattern and not a mistake, you need to be careful who you tell. Not because I think you're naive, because these things have a way of alerting the wrong people if they feel air moving. She was quiet for a moment. You sound like you've seen this before. Yeah, he said. I have. They worked the records for 6 nights. Not together at first. She sent files, he sent observations. Clean, clinical, the kind of communication that has the texture of professional collaboration and nothing else. He would flag something. She would pull the original document. He would send back 3 questions. The 3rd night, at 10 p.m., he called instead of emailing. I need to see the vendor registration records from this period, he said. Not the payments, the registrations. The original onboarding documents for these vendors. I'll have to access the archived system. That's a different login. She was already moving toward her home office. Give me 10 minutes. Sure. She pulled up the archived vendor database. He stayed on the line and she could hear quiet. The particular quiet of a house where a child was asleep. She had been in that kind of quiet for about 30 seconds before she understood what it was. That absence of noise that still feels full. Got it, she said. What am I looking for? Pull up vendor ID 4471-B and 4471-C. Tell me the registration dates. She found them. March 14th and March 22nd, 4 years ago. And the first payment to each? March 28th, both. A pause on the line. She heard him exhale slowly. These aren't separate vendors, he said. They're the same entity. Someone registered them 9 days apart under marginally different names to split payments below the internal review threshold. She stared at the screen. Below threshold for what? Whatever your internal audit trigger is. My guess is $25,000. Anything over 25 gets flagged for secondary review. She looked at the payment amounts. $24,800. $24,900. Both. Someone knew our review threshold, she said. Someone on the inside, he said. Yeah. She sat down. The home office was quiet too, but differently. The quiet of a big apartment with too much space and not enough noise in it, which she had never particularly noticed before. This is bad, she said. Yes. How bad? He took a moment. She had noticed that about him. He didn't fill pauses with noise. He let them be what they were. I've seen structures like this before. The split payments, the vendor duplication, the timing. It's designed to be deniable. Any single piece of it looks like an administrative error. But when you map the pattern over time, when you look at where the money actually went, he trailed off briefly. I need to see the full 4-year window, every vendor in that division, every contract touched by the same internal authorization chain. That's going to be hundreds of documents. Yeah, he said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. He paused. Okay? Yeah. She was already reaching for the archived system. Okay. A very brief sound on the line, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent, like recognition. I'll make coffee, he said. They worked until 2 in the morning. The fourth night, she drove to his apartment. She told herself it was because the document transfers were taking too long, and she needed someone to physically review the original contracts she'd pulled from storage. That was true. It was also true that she had been in her office for 3 weeks with a growing sense of dread, and sitting across from someone who had seen this kind of thing before and not been destroyed by it seemed, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, like something she needed. He buzzed her up without comment. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 6 blocks from the harbor. It was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Not sterile, not staged, but genuinely clean in the way that takes daily effort rather than periodic performance. There were things everywhere that a child lived with. A plastic dinosaur on the kitchen counter. A drawing taped to the refrigerator. Another beach scene she noticed, the ocean this time correctly blue. A pair of small shoes by the door that were facing opposite directions. Landon was in a dark gray Henley, and he had clearly been working before she arrived. The kitchen table was covered in printouts, and there were 2 mugs of coffee ready. Noah's asleep, he said quietly. If you can keep the volume manageable. Of course. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her. They spread the documents between them. For a while there was just the sound of papers and the occasional quiet exchange about dates and numbers and authorization codes. The particular rhythm of 2 people who've both learned how to work without needing to fill silence. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, she became aware that this was the least tense she had felt in 3 weeks. Not because the situation had improved. The documents were, if anything, getting worse the more they reviewed them. But there was something grounding about the physical presence of someone who understood what they were looking at and was not panicking. You're calm, she said at one point. He glanced up from a document. Not particularly. You look calm. He set the paper down. I learned a long time ago that looking calm is different from being calm. It's useful sometimes to look calm. He paused. What I actually am is angry, but that's not helpful right now. She looked at him. Angry at what? He didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, set it down. I'll tell you when we know more, he said. From down the hall, from behind a closed door, came a small sound. A shift, a murmur, the unconscious noise of a sleeping child. Both of them went quiet for a moment, listening. The sound resolved into silence. Landon relaxed slightly. He has bad dreams sometimes. Not often. What does he dream about? He looked at her. Something in his expression was careful. His mom, sometimes. I think. He doesn't usually want to talk about it in the morning. Avery looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. The ocean, correctly blue. The two figures. He knows she's gone, she asked, and then immediately felt the question land wrong. Sorry, that's... I don't know why I asked that. He knows, Landon said, without offense. He was 14 months old when she died. He doesn't remember her, but he knows she existed, he knows she's gone, and he knows... He stopped, started again. He knows he's not missing something he's supposed to have. He's just got different than other kids. That's how we talk about it. Different, not less. She heard that distinction. She looked at the documents, the vendor IDs, the split payments, the authorization chain that led, consistently, to the same name. Vincent has been with our company for 22 years, she said. I know. My father trusted him completely. I know. My grandfather liked him. Landon didn't say anything, just looked at her. When this breaks, she said, it won't just be a legal problem. It'll be everything my family built, the credibility of it. People trusted the company because people trusted the Kensington name, and if the company was being used to... She stopped. It was being used, Landon said carefully. That doesn't mean you built it on lies. It means someone inside it acted like they owned something they didn't own. She looked at him. You didn't do this, he said. Someone did it to you. There's a difference. She nodded. It didn't entirely land yet. It was the kind of thing that takes time to settle into, the way all important things do. But she heard it. They worked for another 2 hours. When she left at 2 in the morning, she passed the shoes by the door, still facing opposite directions. And for some reason, she thought about the drawing on the refrigerator, and the beach they hadn't gotten to yet, and the way Noah had explained the ocean incorrectly and then drawn it correctly anyway. She drove home through Charleston streets that were empty except for a few lights along the harbor. She slept, for the first time in a week, without difficulty. The morning after Avery left his apartment, Landon stood in the kitchen at 5:50 a.m., making Noah's breakfast and thinking about a dead woman he had never met. Not Kara. He thought about Kara constantly, in the way that grief works after 4 years, not like a wound anymore, but like a structural change, something that had altered the load-bearing walls of who he was and couldn't be undone, only accommodated. He had learned to accommodate it. He was thinking about Kara's files. He hadn't told Avery yet. He wasn't sure when he was going to tell Avery, or how, or whether he'd fully processed it enough himself to hand it to someone else as information rather than as the thing it actually was, which was a gut punch he'd been sitting with for 72 hours. Noah came out of his room at 6:15 in dinosaur pajamas, with his hair doing something architecturally improbable on the left side, dragging a stuffed triceratops by one horn. Dad, is it a school day? Wednesday. Yeah. Noah climbed onto the kitchen chair and studied the bowl of oatmeal with the expression of someone who had hoped for something better but was prepared to accept reality. Can I have brown sugar? There's already brown sugar in it. More brown sugar? No. Noah poked the oatmeal. Dad, what were you doing last night? I woke up and there was someone here. Landon set his own coffee down. A colleague. We were working on something. At nighttime? Sometimes work happens at nighttime. Noah considered this with the philosophical openness of a 5-year-old who had not yet developed a consistent sense of appropriate working hours. Was it the tall lady? Landon looked at him. What? Mrs. Okafor showed me the thing on her phone, the video. With the lady talking and you on the ladder. Noah was eating the oatmeal now, unconcerned. She's tall. In the video. Landon was quiet for a moment. He had known, abstractly, that Noah would encounter the video eventually. 2 million views didn't stay abstract for long in a building where Mrs. Okafor had a smartphone and strong opinions. He had just hoped for more time. Yeah, he said. That was her. What did she say? Mrs. Okafor wouldn't explain the talking part. She said something I didn't agree with. Noah looked up from the oatmeal. Did you tell her? Not then. Are you going to tell her? Landon picked up his coffee. In a way. Noah seemed to find this acceptable. He went back to the oatmeal, then said, without looking up, she seemed nice when she was here. Her shoes were good. Grown-ups with good shoes are usually nice. Landon stared at his son for a moment. Finish your oatmeal, he said. He dropped Noah at school by 7:40, drove back across town, sat in the parking lot of the Meridian for 12 minutes without getting out of the truck, and then called a number he hadn't called in over a year. It rang 4 times before someone answered. Pierce. The voice was rough, the accent somewhere between Georgia and 20 years of not caring where it was from. Special Agent Dennis Farrow, retired 11 months ago, currently living in Savannah with a boat he kept threatening to take out and never did. It's Landon. I know it's Landon. Your name came up on my screen. A pause, and the background sound of something being set down. A mug, probably. Farrow was always drinking something. You're not a call I expected before 8 a.m. on a Wednesday. I need to talk to you about something, unofficially. All my conversations are unofficial now. I'm retired. I know. I have a boat. I know about the boat, Dennis. I'm going to take it out this weekend. Dennis. A sigh. What is it? Landon stared at the parking lot. A seagull was investigating a paper cup near the entrance. I found something in Kara's files. The line went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause, the quiet of a man recalibrating. What kind of something? Farrow said finally. The kind she would have brought to you if she'd had more time. Another silence. Longer. You should come to Savannah, Farrow said. Not today. This weekend. Bring the boy if you need to. We'll talk on the boat. You don't take the boat out. I will for this. His voice had shifted. Not softer, but more careful. The voice of someone who had spent 30 years listening for what people weren't saying. Landon, how bad is it? Landon watched the seagull successfully extract something from the paper cup and fly away with it. Bad enough that I'm parked outside a hotel at 7:50 a.m. thinking about your boat, he said. Farrow let out a long breath. Saturday, he said. Come Saturday. Landon said he would, ended the call, and got out of the truck. He had a chandelier to finish. The brass bracket had arrived from the Savannah supplier 2 days ago, and he had been waiting for a morning with no scheduled access to the ballroom. Today the ballroom was empty until noon. He set up the ladder, checked his tools, checked the specifications, and climbed. Working at height with his hands occupied was, he had discovered after Kara died, one of the only states in which his brain would stop running the same loops. When he was on a ladder, the present tense was a physical fact. The bracket was either correctly seated or it wasn't. The crystal alignment was either right or it wasn't. There was no room for the other thing, the constant low hum of everything he couldn't fix. He was halfway through the bracket installation when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He ignored it again. On the third buzz, he came down because 3 in a row meant either Noah's school or something he shouldn't ignore, and he checked the screen. 3 texts from Avery, sent within 60 seconds of each other, the authorization chain. I found something else. It goes further back than 4 years. Can you come to the office today? He read them twice. He looked at the chandelier half finished above him, bracket seated but not yet torqued to spec. He texted back, What time? The response came in under 10 seconds. Now would be good. He looked at the chandelier again. He took out his reference card and marked exactly where he'd stopped. He put his tools away in the correct order. He climbed back up to check that the bracket was safe in its temporary state. Not finished, but stable. Then he drove to the 28th floor of the Kensington Maritime Building, parked in a visitor space, and told the lobby receptionist that Avery Kensington was expecting him. The receptionist looked at his maintenance shirt, then at his face, then at his maintenance shirt again. "Of course," she said, in a tone that suggested it was not of course at all, and picked up the phone. He waited in the lobby without sitting down. He looked at the lobby while he waited. The Kensington Maritime Building had a different aesthetic than the Meridian, newer and more deliberate, all glass and clean lines. On the lobby wall, a large framed photograph. The original Kensington docks, 1948, black and white, a working waterfront full of men who looked like they believed in what they were building. He was still looking at it when the elevator opened and Margot came out rather than Avery. He'd only met Margot briefly before, during the initial meeting setup. She was the kind of person who assessed you in the first 3 seconds and filed the results somewhere accessible. She looked at him now with an expression that was efficient and not unkind. "She's on a call that won't end for another 7 minutes, Margot said. "I'll take you up." "Okay." In the elevator, she said, "You've been helping her with the records." "Yes." "She doesn't usually ask for help." "I noticed." Margot looked at him sideways. "Is it as bad as she thinks it is?" He considered the question, not whether to answer, but how. "Depends on what she thinks," he said. Margot made a sound that was not satisfied with that answer, but accepted it as the answer she was going to get. The elevator opened on 28. "Down the hall," she said. "Last door on the right. I'll send her in when she's off." He went down the hall and through the door into what turned out to be not Avery's main office, but a smaller conference room, which was currently in a state that he recognized immediately. A working state, not a staged one. Documents spread across the table, 2 laptops open, a whiteboard on one wall covered in dates and numbers, and connecting lines drawn in red marker. She'd been building a map. He stood at the whiteboard for a moment, reading what she'd constructed. The timeline started further left than he'd expected. Not 4 years ago, but 6, maybe 7. She'd extended it. He heard her behind him and turned. She looked like she hadn't slept again. Not badly. She still had the kind of presence that filled a room without trying, but there were edges on her that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, something tighter around the eyes. "The authorization chain," she said, closing the door. "I went back further. 6 years ago, there are the same structural anomalies, different vendors, different amounts, but the same methodology, same authorization path. You built a timeline." He nodded toward the whiteboard. "I needed to see it all at once." She moved to stand beside him, looking at it. 6 years. Over 6 years if the pattern holds throughout. And it's consistent enough that it's not mistakes. "No," he said. "It's not mistakes." She had crossed her arms, not closed off. He'd started to read the difference in how she held herself. And this was less defensive than steadying, like she was keeping herself upright through an act of will. "How much?" she asked. "Can you estimate?" He thought about the vendor splits, the threshold manipulation, the frequency over 6 years. "Rough estimate, based on what I've seen, somewhere between 4 and 8 million. Could be higher if there are channels I haven't identified." She was quiet. "Avery." She looked at him. "This didn't break your company, Becta," he said. "The company is still standing. The money is a significant problem, but it's recoverable. What matters now is building the evidentiary case correctly, so that when this goes where it has to go, it sticks." "To the board," she said, "and to federal investigators." Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been in charge long enough that asking for help from external authority feels like a partial surrender, even when it's the right move. "I know people," he said. "People I trust. I was going to talk to one of them this weekend anyway." She looked at him sharply. "You were already... There's something I haven't told you yet." He held her gaze. "I found it a few days ago, and I needed to be sure I understood it before I said it out loud." The room got quieter somehow, though nothing had changed. "My wife," he said carefully, "was an investigator. Financial crimes, same as me, different division. We met at the bureau." He stopped. Organized the next part. "About 6 weeks before she died, she mentioned she'd picked up something in her caseload that connected to a maritime company in Charleston. She didn't give me details, We had a rule about not bringing cases home. It was one of the ways we kept things clean. He paused. She died before she could take it further. Avery was very still. After she died, everything went to her division chief. Cold files. I never saw the case documentation because I was barely functional for about 3 months and then I left the bureau. He looked at the whiteboard. When I pulled the files you sent me, the vendor registration records, the authorization chains, I recognized the methodology. Not because I'd seen your company before, because I'd seen Kara's notes. A long silence. How? Avery said. I kept some of her work notebooks. I shouldn't have. They were bureau property, but I didn't know that when I packed up her office. I just packed everything. He'd never told anyone this. I've had them in a box. I went back to look at them 3 days ago. What's in them? Fragments. She hadn't gotten far, but the methodology she was documenting, the vendor splitting, the threshold manipulation, it matches. Same fingerprints, he paused. And there's a name. She waited. Caldwell, he said. She had a question mark next to it. Not confirmed, but she had his name. Avery put her hand on the back of a chair. Not dramatically, just resting it there, like she needed something solid. She was looking at Vincent, she said. She was starting to look at him. I think if she'd had more time, he stopped. There was no useful end to that sentence. Avery looked at the whiteboard. She looked at the red lines she'd drawn connecting dates and names and numbers. She looked at the photograph Landon had noticed she kept on the conference room credenza, not her grandfather's portrait, which was presumably elsewhere in the building, but a small, informal photo of 2 people at what looked like a dock, one of whom he recognized as a younger Avery and the other presumably her father. Vincent was the one who told my father to trust him, she said. Her voice was flat, but not cold. Flat in the way that something is flat when it is carrying significant weight. 22 years ago, Vincent was the one who said he knew the right people, the right structures, the right way to grow the company without exposing it to risk. My father believed him. She stopped. My grandfather believed him. People like Vincent spend a long time earning that belief, Landon said. That's part of the methodology too, the patience of it. She turned and looked at him. Your wife was 27. Yes. She was this close. Yes. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read. Grief, maybe, for a woman she'd never known, or the particular ache of proximity to something terrible that you narrowly missed. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry, he said, not harshly. Help me finish it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down and pulled one of the laptops toward her and said, Tell me exactly what was in her notebooks. So he told her. He had never said it out loud to anyone, not in 4 years. He'd carried it the way he carried most things, quietly, internally, in the particular storage system of a man who had learned that the interior space was where things went when there was no appropriate external place for them. He told her about Kara's handwriting, which was fast and sideways and full of abbreviations only she fully understood. He told her about the vendor code she'd been cross-referencing and the authorization pathway she'd flagged with a double underline, which meant, in her system, this person knows more than they should. He told her about the name Caldwell with the question mark, surrounded by 3 other names he didn't recognize, which he had since looked up and found that 2 of them no longer worked in the industry and 1 of them had died. He told her without editorializing, without performing the emotion of it, because that was the only way he knew how to do it, cleanly, like a report, like information that needed to be transmitted accurately, regardless of what it cost to transmit. When he stopped talking, the room was quiet. Avery had been taking notes. She looked down at what she'd written and then up at him. The names she had, she said quietly. The 2 who left the industry. Do you remember where they were? Maritime sector. 1 was a logistics firm in Georgia. 1 was a port authority position in South Carolina. He paused. I'll get you the specifics. I have them written down. They could be witnesses. If they knew something and left because of it, or they were pushed out because they were getting close, he said. Both options are possible. She nodded. She was writing again, and he watched her hands move across the notepad. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. the same quality in her handwriting that he'd noticed in everything else she did. She didn't have Kara's sideways abbreviations. She wrote in straight, fast lines, slanting slightly right, like she was always moving forward even on paper. He made himself stop noticing that. "I'm going to Savannah this weekend," he said. "Dennis Farrow, he was my division chief for 3 years. He's retired, but he still has contacts, and more importantly, he understands how to structure an evidentiary case so it doesn't collapse." He paused. "I think you should come." She looked up. "Not officially," he said. "Not as Kensington Maritime, just as someone who has information that needs to be in the right hands." "That's a significant step," she said. "Yeah, it is." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the whiteboard. All those red lines. "I'll need to keep this away from the internal legal team for now," she said. "If Caldwell has any reach into that team, and I don't know that he does, but I can't rule it out." "Agreed. Nothing internal until we know the shape of it." "Margot," she said, "I'll need Margot to know. She's been with the family since I was 19. If I'm keeping this from everyone else, I can't keep it from her. She'd notice in about 6 hours, and then I'd have a bigger problem." "That's your call," he said. "She won't be a liability." "I'm not saying she will be." Avery looked at him. "You're being careful about who you disagree with." "I'm being careful about what matters. Margot is your person. I don't have an opinion on your person." He paused. "I have my own." She almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd had in the meeting at the Meridian, the one that arrived and then thought better of itself. "Mrs. Okafor?" "Mrs. Okafor has been known to repeat things at the wrong moment. Dennis Farrow will take what I tell him to his actual grave." "Okay," she said. "Saturday. I'll have Noah." "Okay?" "He'll probably talk about dinosaurs for most of the drive." She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, not the professional steadiness she usually kept, but something underneath it, something she didn't appear to have entirely meant to show. "I can handle dinosaurs," she said. He believed her, which surprised him slightly. The rest of the week moved in the way that weeks move when they contain something large and unresolved at the center. Simultaneously slow and too fast, the ordinary hours stretching out and then collapsing without warning into the next thing. Landon finished the chandelier on Thursday morning. He torqued the bracket to spec, aligned all 700 crystals according to the restoration document, replaced the 4 missing bulbs with the correct wattage, and climbed down the ladder for the last time in the Meridian ballroom. Gerald appeared at his shoulder, looking up. "Is it done?" "It's done." It looks exactly as it should. Exactly." Gerald was nodding with the enthusiasm of a man who had been anxious about something for 2 months and could now stop being anxious about it. "Remarkable work. I'll make sure the report to Ms. Kensington reflects—" "It doesn't need to reflect anything," Landon said, folding the ladder. "It's a chandelier. It should look like it should look." Gerald blinked. "Of course, yes, still. Thank you, Gerald." He carried the ladder to the service corridor and went home to pick up Noah from school. Noah came out the front doors of the school in a cluster of 5-year-olds moving at different speeds and trajectories, spotted Landon, and launched into a run that had the full-body commitment of someone who has been stationary too long and has opinions about it. Dad, we learned about tide pools today. Tide pools are where ocean things live in little pools when the tide goes out and you can actually see them. Can we go see tide pools?" "We can go see tide pools." Noah grabbed his hand and they walked toward the truck. "Are we going to the beach this weekend?" "You said maybe." "We're going to Savannah." Noah processed this. "Is Savannah near the ocean?" "It's near water." "Does it have tide pools?" "I don't know, maybe." Noah seemed to decide this was acceptable. He climbed into the truck and immediately began explaining the difference between a tide pool and a regular pool to the triceratops he'd apparently brought to school inside his backpack, which Landon made a mental note to address regarding the school's policy on personal items. He drove home and stood in the kitchen making dinner. Pasta, because Thursday was pasta. Because routine was the architecture that held things up. And thought about Kara. He didn't usually let himself think about her this concretely, which he understood was its own kind of problem, the kind that therapists who hadn't met him yet had opinions about. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he let it happen. She had been onto something. She had been 3 months into a case that she'd mentioned once over dinner with that particular way she had of describing work. Careful, precise, the specific details withheld, but the shape of the thing given, like a silhouette. Maritime company. Somebody's been creative with the accounting for a long time. I think it goes higher than whoever's touching the books. He had said, "How high?" She had said, "High enough that I need to be careful." He had said, "Be careful." She had laughed and said, "Always." 6 weeks later, she was gone. Not from the case, not from the bureau, from everything. Cardiac arrhythmia, the coroner said, undiagnosed. Could have happened any time, the cardiologist explained, as if that was supposed to make it better, as if any time was a comfort rather than the thing that kept him awake for the better part of a year. He drained the pasta. Noah had moved from the Triceratops to a running commentary on tide pools that had evolved, through some associative logic unique to 5-year-olds, into a comprehensive theory about why starfish didn't have faces. It's because they feel with their whole body, Noah said seriously, so they don't need faces for feeling. Huh, Landon said. He put the pasta on the table. Do you think that's lonely? Landon sat down. He looked at his son, the small face, the impossible hair, the complete sincerity of the question. No, he said. I think they feel everything they need to feel. Noah considered this, then picked up his fork. Okay, he said, satisfied. That's good then. Landon ate his dinner. Friday passed in the thick way that the day before a significant thing always passes. He went to the Meridian in the morning, completed the inspection sign-off on the chandelier work, and wrote his notes in the facilities log with the same handwriting he always used. In the afternoon, he picked up Noah, who had further developed his tide pool theory to include a subplot about crabs, and they watched a nature documentary together on the couch after dinner with Noah asleep against his arm by 8:15. He sat with his sleeping son for a while, not moving, not reaching for his phone. The apartment was in that full quiet again. He thought about the records, the 6-year timeline, the vendor splits below the audit threshold, a name with a question mark in a notebook he'd carried across 3 apartments since packing up an office he'd never expected to pack. He thought about Avery in the conference room, her hand on the back of the chair, her voice doing the thing it did when she was keeping it level by choice rather than by nature. Help me finish it. He had said that, and she had pulled out the laptop and said, tell me what was in her notebooks without any of the gentle reluctance people usually brought to that conversation, without the particular softness that he had learned to find exhausting because it required him to manage their discomfort while managing his own. She had just asked and listened and written it down, and there had been something in that, in the clean, functional dignity of being taken at his word, that he hadn't expected to need as much as he apparently had. He moved Noah carefully to the couch, covered him with the blanket from the armchair, and went to the kitchen table. He opened Kara's notebook. Not to review it, he'd read it enough times in the last week that the pages were memorized. He just held it. Let it exist in his hands in the ordinary light of the kitchen, small and worn, her handwriting on every page. Somebody's been creative with the accounting for a long time. Yeah, he said quietly to no one. You were right. He closed the notebook. He put it back in its place. He went to bed. Saturday morning he made eggs because Saturday was eggs, and packed a bag for Noah that contained 2 dinosaurs, a change of clothes, the tide pool library book Noah had brought home and refused to return despite the overdue notice, and the Triceratops, whose presence in public Landon had stopped trying to negotiate. He texted Avery the address. She texted back, I'll meet you there. 2 hours. He drove toward Savannah with Noah in the back seat, narrating the passing landscape with the enthusiasm of someone seeing it for the first time, despite having been on this road twice before. Somewhere south of the state line, Noah went quiet for about 4 minutes, which for Noah constituted either sleep or serious thought. Then, Dad, is the tall lady coming today? Yes. Because of work? Landon kept his eyes on the road. Partly. Noah seemed to process the other part of the answer that Landon hadn't given. Okay, he said. Then, after a moment, does she know about tide pools? I don't know, Landon said honestly. I can tell her, Noah said, with the settled confidence of someone who has something to offer and is willing to offer it. She probably doesn't know everything. Landon said nothing. The road opened up ahead of them, flat and gray and leading south, the kind of road that feels like the beginning of something that hasn't quite announced what it is yet. Dennis Farrow's boat was called the Margaret Ann, after his mother, and it had not left the dock in 4 months, despite everything Farrow had said about weekends and fresh air and the therapeutic value of open water. It sat in its slip at the Savannah Marina, looking clean and maintained and entirely stationary, which Landon felt was an accurate metaphor for retirement, as Farrow practiced it. Farrow himself was standing on the dock when they pulled in, a large man, 63, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of reading people in bad situations and finding most of them wanting. He had a coffee thermos in one hand and was wearing a flannel shirt in a temperature that didn't require flannel, which Landon recognized as one of the privileges of being retired and answering to no one. He looked at Landon's truck. He looked at Landon. Then he looked at Noah, who had climbed out before the engine was fully off and was already assessing the dock with the focused energy of someone who had been stationary for 2 hours and had thoughts about it. "That's a big kid," Farrow said. "He's 5. Big for 5. He eats well." Noah had found a piling and was inspecting it closely. "Is this where the tide pools are?" "No tide pools in a marina, bud," Landon said. "Why not?" "Because there's too much boat traffic. The water doesn't settle enough." Noah accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has learned that the world frequently fails to organize itself according to what would be most interesting. He turned and looked at Farrow with the direct, assessing gaze that 5-year-olds deploy without any awareness of how unnerving it is. "Are you Dad's friend?" he asked. Farrow looked down at him. "Something like that." "What's your boat called?" "Margaret Ann." "That's a person's name." "Yes, it is." "Is Margaret Ann here?" "She passed away," Farrow said, without the particular softness most adults brought to death when talking to children. "Just a fact," stated plainly. Noah nodded. "My mom passed away too," he said. "Also a fact." Also stated plainly, in the way that children who have grown up with the truth state it. Not without weight, but without the careful handling that adults apply because the careful handling is for them, not for the child. Farrow looked at him for a moment, then at Landon. "Kid's all right," he said. "I know," Landon said. They were still standing on the dock when a car pulled into the marina lot. A dark sedan, no driver Landon recognized, and then the door opened and it was Avery. She had dressed differently than he'd ever seen her, dark jeans, a plain navy jacket, her hair pulled back simply. She looked like a person rather than a presentation, which he was fairly sure was a deliberate choice, and it worked. She spotted them, lifted a hand, and walked down the dock with the particular walk of someone who has been in rooms their whole life that required a certain carriage, and has learned it so thoroughly that it doesn't entirely leave even in a marina on a Saturday morning. Noah saw her from 40 feet away. "Dad," he said, in a carrying whisper that was not a whisper in any functional sense. "She's tall." "Noah?" "I'm just saying." Avery reached them, and Farrow looked at her with the same unvarnished assessment he applied to everything. She met it without flinching, which Landon noticed Farrow also noticed. "Dennis Farrow," he said, extending a hand. "Avery Kensington." She shook it. "Thank you for meeting us." "Haven't done anything yet." He glanced at Landon. "Let's get on the boat." The Margaret Ann had a cabin below deck with a table, and that was where they sat. Farrow across from Avery and Landon, a legal pad in front of him and the coffee thermos within reach. Noah having been established above deck with a bag of crackers, the tide pool book, and strict instructions not to step off the boat, which Noah had agreed to with the sincerity of someone who had every intention of pushing the exact boundary of what stepping off entailed. Farrow had said nothing substantive since the dock. He had the interviewer's habit of letting people fill silence, which Landon recognized and respected, and which Avery appeared to recognize and meet with her own stillness. The three of them sat for a moment. Then Farrow said, "Tell me from the beginning. Not the financial beginning. The beginning of how you got here." So they told him. Landon started because the beginning was Kara's notebook, And then Avery continued with the records and the whiteboard and the 6-year timeline, and they passed it back and forth with the rhythm of two people who had been talking about the same thing for long enough that they knew which parts belonged to whom. Pharaoh listened. He took occasional notes. He asked 3 questions during the entire account, each of them precise and aimed at exactly the structural weakness Landon would have asked about if he'd been on the other side of the table. When they finished, the marina was quiet outside. They could hear Noah above them, talking to the tide pool book with the same running commentary he applied to everything. Pharaoh looked at his notepad. He looked at the thermos. He poured himself more coffee and didn't offer any to them, which was Pharaoh's way of thinking, and Landon had learned not to take it personally. "The notebook," Pharaoh said finally. "Kara's. You have the original." "Yes." "That's a problem and an asset. Problem because it was technically bureau property and you've had it for 4 years. Asset because it's original documentation in her hand, which is harder to dispute than a digital record." He looked at Avery. "The vendor registrations you pulled? Those are still in the company system?" "Archived system, yes." "Who else has access to that archive?" "In theory, executive level and above, plus the IT team." "In theory," Pharaoh repeated. "I know," she said. "The authorization chain, the one that runs through Caldwell's division. How many steps between his signature and the actual vendor payment?" 2. His direct authorization, routed through a divisional account manager who has since left the company. Pharaoh made a note. "Voluntarily?" Avery paused. "The stated reason was personal, family relocation, about 14 months ago." 14 months ago. Pharaoh looked up. "That's around the time you would have been approaching the period when a routine audit might have flagged the pattern," she said. "If anyone had been looking." "Were they?" She was quiet for a moment. "Our internal audit function was restructured 18 months ago. New structure, new team lead. The previous audit director retired." She stopped. Vincent chaired the restructuring committee. Pharaoh wrote something down, underlined it. "He's been managing the exposure," Landon said. "Carefully," Pharaoh agreed. "Over a long time. This isn't someone who panics. This is someone who thinks in years." He looked at Avery. "How much does he know about what you know?" "Nothing. I've been careful." "Who in your organization have you discussed this with?" "Landon. My assistant Margot, who I trust without reservation and who has been told only that there's an internal financial discrepancy under review." "Attorneys?" "No." "Good." Pharaoh set down his pen. "Here's the situation as I see it. You have enough to open a serious federal investigation. What you don't have yet is the complete chain. You have one end of the money and the mechanism, but you don't have the destination. Where did it go after Caldwell's division?" "I haven't been able to trace it past the vendor accounts," Avery said. "Both vendors were shell registrations. The accounts were closed within 60 days of each payment." "Then whoever set this up had banking infrastructure ready," Pharaoh said. "That level of preparation doesn't happen alone. There are likely other parties involved, either co-conspirators or people who provided the financial architecture without knowing fully what it was for." He paused. "The 2 names from Kara's notebook, the ones who left the maritime sector. I can run them quietly through some contacts. Not official, not yet, but enough to get a shape." "I'd appreciate that," Landon said. Pharaoh looked at him steadily for a moment, the way he sometimes looked at people when he was saying something that the words weren't quite carrying. "She was good, Landon. Kara. She was one of the best I had." The cabin was quiet. "I know," Landon said. "She would have cracked it." "Yeah," he held Pharaoh's gaze. "We're going to crack it for her." From above deck, Noah's voice floated down. "Dad, there's a seagull up here and it's looking at my crackers." "Don't feed it," Landon called back. "I'm not feeding it. It's just very interested." "Don't encourage it." A pause. "What if it's hungry?" Pharaoh made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Landon had heard from him in about 3 years. Avery looked at the ceiling of the cabin with an expression that was, briefly, entirely unguarded, something warm and involuntary crossing her face before she brought it back. She caught Landon noticing and looked at the table. "What do we do now?" she asked Pharaoh. "You go home," he said. "You act completely normal." Nothing changes in how you interact with Caldwell. Nothing. Not a degree of temperature. People who know they're being watched behave differently, and he spent 22 years reading that company. He'll feel a shift before he sees one. He looked at Avery hard. Can you do that? Yes, she said. You're sure? Because you've been spending the last 3 weeks in the records. That's time away from the floor, from routine contact. If he's been paying attention, I've been framing it as renovation oversight, she said. The Meridian Project. There's legitimate reason for me to be in and out of site documentation. Farrow glanced at Landon. That's her cover. She didn't need my help with it, Landon said. Farrow looked back at Avery with something that wasn't quite approval but was adjacent to it. I'll have something on the 2 names in about a week, he said. When I do, we talk again. By then, I'll also have had a conversation with someone at the Bureau. Someone I trust, not someone who'll log it before they understand it. He paused. You understand that once federal investigators are formally involved, you lose control of the timeline. I understand. And you're prepared for what that means for your company's public profile during an active investigation. She didn't hesitate. The company's public profile is not more important than what's right. Farrow looked at her for a long moment. She held it. All right, he said, and picked up his pen again. Let's go through the vendor list one more time. I want to see if there's a pattern in the closing dates. They worked for another hour and 40 minutes in the cabin of the Margaret Ann, while the boat stayed exactly where it was, and Noah negotiated a complex détente with the Seagull above them, the details of which Landon decided he didn't need to fully understand. When they came up from the cabin, the afternoon had shifted and the harbor light had gone gold and lateral. Noah was sitting cross-legged near the stern with the tide pool book open in his lap and approximately 1/3 of his crackers remaining, which suggested the Seagull détente had involved some concessions. He looked up when Avery emerged and studied her for a moment with that unsettling directness. Did you do your work? He asked. We did, she said. Is it fixed? She glanced at Landon briefly. Not yet. We're working on it. Noah nodded, accepting this the way he accepted the incomplete answer about beach weekends and tide pool proximity. Then he held up the book. Do you know about tide pools? Not much, she said. His face took on the focused expression of someone about to render a genuine service. Sit down, he said, patting the deck beside him. I'll explain. She looked at the deck. She was wearing dark jeans that probably cost more than Landon's truck payment. She sat down on the deck of the boat without any apparent hesitation, folded her knees, and looked at the book. Noah began to explain tide pools with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for an audience worthy of the material. Landon stood back and watched. Farrow appeared at his shoulder with the thermos. She's not what I expected, Farrow said quietly. No, Landon said. She's not. What did you expect? Landon thought about it honestly. Someone who needed handling. Farrow made a sound. And? She doesn't need handling, Landon said. She needs someone to stand next to her while she handles things herself. Farrow poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Landon without being asked. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Noah explain the structural advantages of an exoskeleton to a billionaire sitting on a boat deck, who was listening with what appeared to be genuine attention. You're in trouble, Farrow said. Not unkindly. I know, Landon said. She's your principal in an active investigation. I'm not officially in an investigation. I'm a facilities manager who found some old notebooks. Landon. Dennis. Farrow drank his coffee. Just be careful with yourself, he said. You've had a hard 4 years. Don't make decisions out of the relief of things feeling less hard. It was the most personal thing Farrow had said to him in recent memory, which meant the old man was genuinely concerned, which Landon filed and didn't respond to directly, because responding to it directly was not how either of them operated. I'm always careful, he said. Farrow looked at him sideways. Son, you kept a dead woman's notebooks in a moving box for 4 years and drove 3 hours to show them to a stranger. You're not always careful. Landon drank the coffee. The drive back to Charleston was quiet for the first 40 minutes because Noah fell asleep before they cleared the city limits, the Triceratops tucked under his arm, and the tide pool book open on his lap to a page about hermit crabs. Avery followed behind in her car for the first stretch, and then somewhere on the highway the cars got separated by a truck merge, and Landon drove the rest of the way alone. He kept checking the rearview mirror even after she was gone from view. He made himself stop. Monday morning, Kensington Maritime felt different in the way that places feel different when you know something about them that most people in them don't know. Avery walked the 28th floor at 8 a.m., said good morning to the people she passed, read the weekend's shipping reports, and attended a 10 o'clock operations meeting where Vincent Caldwell sat across the conference table with his silver-haired reliability and his pocket square and his memory for everyone's names. And she looked at him the same way she always looked at him. She was good at it. She'd been managing her own face in difficult rooms since she was 16 years old, and her father first brought her to a board meeting and told her that whatever she felt, she should wear the room's temperature, not her own. She wore the room's temperature. Vincent gave a report on third-quarter logistics performance that was comprehensive and well-structured and delivered with the ease of someone who had given 1,000 reports and was comfortable in front of this table. He caught her eye once, near the end, with a small collegial smile that she had seen him give her father 100 times. She smiled back. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and spent 3 minutes looking at the harbor through the window, and then she opened her laptop and kept working. She called Landon that evening. Not about the records. He heard it immediately. The quality of the call, the slightly different pace of her breathing. "Rough day?" he asked. "Long meeting." Vincent was in it. A pause. "I keep looking at him and thinking, 22 years. He's known my family for 22 years. He was at my father's hospital when Dad had the stroke." Her voice was flat again, in that load-bearing way. He held my hand in the waiting room. Landon was in the kitchen. Noah was in the bath, audibly. "People who do what he's done get good at that," he said. "The proximity, the warmth. It's how they stay safe." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't make it less—" "No," he said. "It doesn't." The bath sounds from the bathroom had evolved into what appeared to be a naval engagement involving multiple plastic dinosaurs, the strategic details of which Noah was announcing to no one in particular. Avery heard it through the phone. He could tell by the slight pause. "How's he doing?" she asked. "Currently conducting a battle involving a brachiosaur and what I think is a submarine." "Where did he get a submarine?" "Mrs. Okafor. She has no concept of dinosaur authenticity." A sound on the line, something between a breath and a laugh, small and involuntary, the kind that happens before someone decides whether to have it. She let it happen. "Avery," he said, "you're going to get through the next few weeks. You know that." "Do I?" "You've been running a billion-dollar company since you were 26. You've sat across the table from people who were trying to take things from you your entire career and you haven't lost anything you couldn't afford to lose." He paused. "You can sit across from one man for a few more weeks." She was quiet. "The thing I'm worried about," she said finally, "isn't the meetings. It's what happens after. Even if everything goes the way it should go. The company's reputation. The board. My father built that company's credibility for 40 years, and when this comes out, and it has to come out, I know it has to, people are going to look at the Kensington name and see the corruption story, not the 40 years. Some people will," he said honestly. "And then time passes and they see more of the story." "That's easy to say." "Yeah," he said. "It is. Doesn't make it wrong." Another pause. Then, "Landon." "Yeah." "Thank you." She said it simply, without the professional framing she usually put around things. Just the 2 words. "For the notebooks, for Savannah, for all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Noah wants to go back to see if there are tide pools," he said. "You gave him an incomplete answer about the Savannah coastline." She made that sound again, the involuntary almost laugh. "I told him I wasn't sure. He's been researching it. He has opinions now. Of course he does. He's going to want to present them." "I'm available," she said, and there was something in how she said it that had more than one meaning. He chose not to examine that too closely. They said goodnight. He put his phone down, went to the bathroom, pulled a soaking Noah out of the tub over significant protest, dried him, got him into pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed while Noah ran through the day with the decompression energy of a child who has been orderly for 8 hours and needs to discharge it all before sleep. Dad. Yeah. Is the tall lady our friend now? Landon thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Yeah, he said. She's our friend. Noah considered this, pulling the blanket up. I told her about the hermit crabs, he said. She asked good questions. She asked good questions about most things. Does she know what tide pools are now? She knows more than she did. Noah seemed satisfied. He turned on his side, face toward the dinosaur nightlight that Mrs. Okafor had given him and that Landon had absolutely not purchased himself, and was quiet for a moment. Dad? He said, quieter. Yeah. Did Mom ask good questions? It landed the way it always landed, but not sharply, but fully, the way something lands when it hits the right place. He'd learned to let it hit instead of deflecting, because deflecting made Noah think the subject was off limits, and the subject was not off limits. The best questions, he said. She never accepted a surface answer. She always wanted to know the thing underneath the thing. Noah was quiet, processing. Like with tide pools, he said. You have to get close to see what's really there. Yeah, Landon said. Like that. Noah closed his eyes. Landon sat on the edge of the bed until the breathing slowed and the little fist on the pillow relaxed. Then he went back to the kitchen table and opened his laptop. Pharaoh had sent an email at 9 p.m., which meant Pharaoh had been busy all day and was also not sleeping as well as retired life was supposed to provide. The email was short, in Pharaoh's style. No greeting, no sign-off, just information. First name, Thomas Greer, former logistics director at a Savannah maritime firm. Left industry 2021. Lives in Beaufort. I have a contact who worked with him. Not connected to your company directly, but worked adjacent to a vendor that appears in your timeline. Worth a conversation. Will arrange. Second name, Patricia Osei, former Assistant Port Authority Director, Columbia SC. Left her position 2022, moved to Atlanta. This one's more interesting. Her exit was apparently not entirely voluntary. Circumstances unclear from the outside. I have a former colleague reaching out. Third thing, the vendor account closings. You mentioned 60 days. I looked at the timing against a financial regulatory calendar from those years. The closings happen within a week of the quarterly reporting window each time. This wasn't arbitrary. Someone knew the schedule. Landon read it twice. Then he forwarded it to Avery with no message, because the information was the message. Her reply came back 11 minutes later. Patricia Osei. If her departure wasn't voluntary, she might know something, or she might be afraid of something. He typed back, Pharaoh is on it. Don't reach out to her directly yet. I know, she replied. Then, go to sleep, Pierce. He looked at the screen for a moment. Same to you, Kensington, he typed. He closed the laptop. He was not, as it turned out, in any position to take his own advice, and he suspected she wasn't either. But the instruction was sound in principle, and principle was something, on a night like this one, when the shape of what they were building was becoming clearer and more dangerous and more real, and the distance between knowing what was right and being able to do it without cost was the same distance it had always been. He sat at the kitchen table for another hour, not reviewing documents, just sitting with it. The week that followed moved on 2 tracks simultaneously. The visible one, where Avery ran a shipping company and Landon managed facilities at a hotel, and nothing appeared to have changed, and the invisible one, where Pharaoh's contacts were moving quietly through Beaufort and Atlanta, and the document record was growing in a secured folder that existed on a drive that had never touched the Kensington Maritime Network. On Thursday, Patricia Osei called Pharaoh. Pharaoh called Landon. Landon called Avery. She picked up on the first ring. She'll talk, he said. Avery was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. When? Saturday. Pharaoh will be there. She wants to meet somewhere she chooses. That's reasonable. She's scared, he said. Pharaoh said she was calm on the phone, but he's been reading people for 30 years and she's scared. Whatever she knows, or whatever she saw, it stayed with her. Did she say how much she knows? She said she knows why she was pushed out. He paused. And she said there's a name she's been sitting on for 3 years that she'll give us in person. Another silence on the line. Longer. Okay, Avery said. It might not be Caldwell. Or it might be, she said, and it might be worse than we already think. He didn't disagree. The thing about pulling threads was that you didn't get to choose how much came with them. Saturday, he said. I'll text you the details when Farrow confirms. Landon. She stopped. Started again. When this is over, when we're on the other side of all of it, I want to take Noah to the beach. He hadn't expected that. He let it sit for a moment. He'll hold you to it, he said. Good, she said. I want him to. He ended the call and stood in the service corridor of the Meridian Hotel, where he had taken the call away from the noise of a delivery coming in through the loading dock. The corridor smelled like cleaning product and old concrete. A fluorescent bulb at the far end was flickering slightly, which he noted automatically and added to the maintenance list in his head. He thought about Patricia Osei, alone in Atlanta for 3 years with someone's name sitting in her chest. He thought about Kara's notebook, with its sideways handwriting and its double underlines. He thought about a question mark next to a name that had spent 22 years in the same building as a family that trusted it. He went back to work. Above him, in the Meridian ballroom, the chandelier hung in its restored state. All 700 crystals aligned, the 1963 brass fittings correctly seated, the light falling the way the original architects had intended it to fall, clean and even and true. It was right, the way he'd said it would be. Not everything was fixable. He knew that better than most people. But some things were, if you read the specifications carefully and didn't improvise with hardware that deserved better. He went back to work, and he waited for Saturday. Patricia Osei chose a diner in Augusta, halfway between Atlanta and everywhere else, the kind of place that had been open since 1987 and smelled like coffee and griddle grease and had booths with red vinyl that had been repaired with electrical tape in at least 3 places. She was already there when they arrived, in the back booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and she looked like someone who had made a decision and was still deciding whether she'd made it correctly. She was 51, with close-cropped natural hair and the precise posture of someone who had spent years in meetings where she was the only woman in the room and had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space, not apologetic, not aggressive, just present in a way that required acknowledgement. She had been assistant director of Port Authority operations for 11 years before leaving. She had a master's degree in maritime law and had written 2 industry papers that Avery had looked up on Friday night and read until 1 in the morning. She watched them come through the door. Farrow first, then Landon, then Avery. And her eyes went to Avery immediately and stayed there. They slid into the booth. A waitress came and went. Farrow ordered coffee. Nobody ordered food. Patricia Osei looked at Avery and said, "You look like your father." Avery went very still. "You knew my father?" "We met twice. Industry conferences about 8 years ago. He was a good man, genuinely. I don't say that about many people in this industry." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "That's part of why I'm here." Farrow had his notepad but hadn't opened it. He understood, Landon knew, that the first part of this conversation was not about notes. It was about trust, which had to be established before it could be used. "Tell us what happened," Farrow said simply. Patricia Osei looked at her coffee. She had clearly rehearsed this, or thought about it enough that it had the shape of rehearsal, but when she started talking, it came out with the irregularity of something real. Pauses in the wrong places. A sentence started and restarted. The grammar of someone organizing memory rather than reciting it. She had been, 3 years ago, reviewing a set of port access authorizations as part of a routine compliance audit. The maritime industry operated on a system of vendor authorizations. Companies seeking access to port facilities had to register, provide documentation, pass financial verification. It was her team's job to make sure the process was clean. Usually, it was. Usually, the problems were administrative, incomplete paperwork, outdated insurance certificates, the ordinary friction of bureaucracy. This had not been ordinary friction. "I found a registration pathway," she said. "A way of authorizing vendors that bypassed the standard financial verification. Not officially. It wasn't a written policy. It wasn't in any manual. It was a practice. Someone had established it as a practice, probably over years, where certain vendors were flagged in the system with a code that routed them around the verification step. Who had access to set that flag? Landon asked. That's what I tried to find out. She looked at him. The flag was set at the director level, but when I traced the logins for the specific vendors I was looking at, the ones that had the flag, the access log showed a user account that had been deactivated 18 months prior. Someone's old credentials still live in the system, being used to set authorizations. A ghost account, Pharaoh said. Yes. And when I tried to trace who had originally set up that account, who had kept it active after the employee left, she stopped. I was told by my director that the compliance audit had been completed and my findings were noted and the matter was being handled at a higher level. Handled how? Avery asked. It wasn't. Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. Nothing happened. I waited 3 months. I followed up twice. The second time I followed up, I was informed that my contract was not being renewed. The stated reason was budget restructuring. She looked at Avery directly. I had just been given a performance commendation 4 months prior. The diner moved around them. A family in a nearby booth, a man at the counter on his phone, the ordinary Saturday morning of people who didn't know they were 12 feet from a conversation that mattered. The vendors, Avery said carefully, the ones with the flag. Do you remember who they were registered to? Patricia reached into the bag beside her and placed a folder on the table. Not thick, maybe 20 pages, but clearly something she'd been keeping somewhere and carrying somewhere and deciding about for a long time. I kept copies, she said. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I knew what it looked like when something real was being buried, and I knew that if I didn't take copies, I would have nothing, and with nothing you can't do anything. She pushed the folder across the table toward Pharaoh. The vendor names are in there, the access log screenshots, the account credentials I identified. Pharaoh opened the folder. He looked at the first page. His face did not change, which with Pharaoh was itself information. He turned the folder so Landon could see. The vendor names were different from the ones in Avery's records. Different shell registrations, different account numbers. But the methodology was identical. The split payments, the threshold avoidance, the account closure timing. 2 separate systems, the Port Authority and Kensington Maritime, being worked in parallel by the same hands. And at the bottom of the access log, the account name that had been setting the ghost authorizations. V. Caldwell. An account deactivated 18 months before the logs Patricia had found. Still running, still opening doors. Avery looked at the page for a long time. He wasn't just working inside the company, she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than Landon expected, and he was already recalibrating his expectations of her upward on a weekly basis. He was working both sides, Port Authority access and company finances. He controlled what came in and he controlled what went out. Complete loop, Pharaoh said. He created the vendors, authorized their port access through the ghost account, ran payments to them through your company's books, and the money cleared through accounts he controlled. No single part of it looks catastrophic on its own. It's the combination. Patricia was watching Avery. The name in the folder, she said, is that... Yes, Avery said. A pause. I've been sitting on that name for 3 years, Patricia said. I didn't know where to take it. I'd tried the internal route and been pushed out. Going public without evidence is just noise. Going to investigators without someone who understood the full picture. She stopped. I didn't have the full picture. You have part of it, Landon said. We have another part. Together. He looked at Pharaoh. Together it's enough to open a formal federal case, Pharaoh said, and enough to keep it from being dismissed or buried. He looked at Patricia. Are you willing to be a formal witness? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her untouched coffee. She looked at the table. She looked like someone doing an honest calculation about cost, what it would require, what it might take from her, whether the account balanced. I left a career I'd spent 15 years building, she said finally. I relocated. I've spent 3 years thinking about what I should have done differently. She looked up. Yes, I'm willing. Pharaoh nodded once. He picked up his pen and opened his notepad. The next 90 minutes were documentation. Not a deposition, not yet, but the careful laying out of facts in order, with dates and account numbers and sequences confirmed and cross-referenced against what Avery and Landon already had. Farrow ran it the way he'd run 1,000 interviews. Methodical, patient, never pushing, always clarifying. Patricia talked. Avery listened and occasionally asked a question that was precise enough that Farrow looked at her twice. Landon mostly watched the room. He had the habit from his years in the bureau. Not paranoia, but awareness. Who was in the space? Who was paying attention to what? Whether anything felt wrong. Nothing felt wrong. It was an ordinary diner on a Saturday morning and no one was watching them. Still, he was glad they'd driven separately from Charleston and that Avery had not told anyone where she was going today, not even Margot. When they were done, Farrow collected Patricia's folder and his own notes. Patricia looked lighter somehow, the way people look when they've put something down that they've been carrying in the wrong position. "What happens now?" she asked. "I make a call to someone at the bureau who I trust completely," Farrow said. "Monday or Tuesday. They'll want to meet with you formally, and they'll want the originals of these documents, but I'll prep them before that meeting so the context is in place." He paused. "Between now and then, nothing changes. You go home, you go about your week, you don't call anyone connected to the Port Authority or to Kensington Maritime. I don't have contact with any of them anymore." "Good. Keep it that way." She stood, and Avery stood too, and there was a moment between the two women. Not dramatic, not a speech, just Patricia looking at Avery with something that was part recognition and part something older. "Your father would be angry," Patricia said, "about what was done inside his company." "Yes," Avery said, "and he'd be glad someone was doing something about it." Avery didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Thank you for keeping the folder." Patricia picked up her bag. "Thank you for being worth keeping it for," she said, and walked out of the diner. The drive back to Charleston took 3 hours. Landon drove it in a state of focused quiet that he recognized as the particular clarity that follows a significant development. Not relief, not triumph, just the clean, functional alertness of someone who has moved from one phase of a problem to the next. He called Noah twice. Once to confirm Mrs. Okafor had him, and once because Noah had apparently reached a critical juncture in explaining the dietary habits of prehistoric marine reptiles and required Landon's immediate input. "Dad, did mosasaurs eat sharks?" "Sometimes, I think." "So they were the sharks of their time." "In a way, yeah." "That's amazing." A pause waited with significance. "I think I want to be a mosasaur for Halloween." "We'll figure it out." "Mrs. Okafor says she can make me a costume." "Does Mrs. Okafor know what a mosasaur is?" "I showed her a picture. She said she could work with it." He ended the call and drove south. Avery called him at 5 when he was an hour from home. "Farrow called," she said. "He's already made contact. His person at the bureau is a section chief named Weatherby. She's meeting with him tomorrow, Sunday, which tells me Farrow explained enough that she understood it couldn't wait until Monday. That's fast. Is that good?" "Farrow doesn't move fast unless he believes in the material," Landon said. "If he's meeting with Weatherby on a Sunday, he thinks it's solid." A pause on the line. The highway noise filled it. "I've been thinking about the timing," Avery said. "Once federal investigators are formally involved, Vincent will know eventually, either through a leak or through a formal notification process, or just because he's been in this industry long enough to have people who tell him things." Her voice was measured. Thinking out loud, which she did with him now, he'd noticed, in a way she clearly didn't do with most people. When he knows, he'll move. He'll try to get ahead of it. "What's his move look like, do you think?" Landon asked. "He controls some of the board relationships. Not all of them, but some. People he's cultivated over years the same way he cultivated my father." She paused. "He'll try to make this about me. About internal mismanagement, about a young CEO who overreached or mishandled something. He'll try to turn the investigation around." "He can try," Landon said. "The documentation doesn't support that." "Documentation doesn't matter if he moves fast enough to create a narrative before the documentation is public. He's been in boardrooms for 22 years. He knows how to shape a narrative." She was right. He knew she was right. It was the part of this that kept him awake in the hours when the rest of it let him rest. Not the evidence, which was solid, but the human machinery of a man who'd spent 2 decades making himself indispensable and who would not go quietly. "Then we can't give him time to move," Landon said. "No," she agreed. "We can't." "Avery." He chose the next words carefully. "The board meeting. The annual Q4 review. When is it?" 3 weeks. "Can it be moved up?" A pause. "I'm the CEO. I can call an emergency session. If you can call it before investigators issue a formal notification, before Vincent has warning, you control the room when the information lands." Silence on the line. He could hear her processing it. Not the idea itself, which she'd probably already considered, but the implications of it, the calculated risk, the thing that could go very right, or if the timing was off, very wrong. "I'd be walking into that room knowing," she said, "and he'd be walking in not knowing." "Yes. Every piece of evidence has to be in order before I step into that room. Every document, every connection, every name. I know. If there's a gap, if he can find one gap, there won't be a gap," he said. "We'll make sure." Another silence. Longer. "Okay," she said. 3 weeks. We build the case completely, and then I call the board." He drove the last hour in the dark, the highway thinning out as he got closer to the city, the lights of Charleston emerging on the horizon the way they always did. Waterfront first, then the rest. The next 2 weeks moved with the compressed intensity of a deadline that is real. Farrow's contact at the Bureau, Section Chief Diane Weatherby, whom Landon had never met but whose reputation he knew from his bureau years as someone who did not tolerate sloppy work or rushed timelines, moved with an efficiency that suggested she'd seen the shape of this kind of case before and understood what the window required. She met with Patricia Osei on a Tuesday and called Farrow Wednesday morning. She wanted Kara's notebooks, officially, formally, with a chain of custody that would survive a courtroom. Landon drove to Savannah on Thursday evening, alone, with the notebooks in a document case, and handed them to Weatherby at a federal field office that smelled like government buildings everywhere smell, that particular mix of industrial cleaner and carpet. Weatherby was 54, compact, with gray at her temples, and the kind of eyes that had processed a significant amount of human dishonesty and remained functional. She looked at the notebooks with the careful hands of someone handling evidence. "These have been in your possession for 4 years, she said. "Yes." "You understand we'll need a formal statement about how you came to have them." "I understand." She looked at him over the notebooks. "You were married to Kara Pierce." "Yes." "I knew her work," Weatherby said. "Not personally. She was in a different division, but I knew her file." She paused. "She was thorough." "She was the most thorough person I've ever met," he said. Weatherby looked at the notebooks again. "This must be strange," she said. "Finishing something she started." "It's what needed doing," he said. She didn't push it further, which he appreciated. She was one of those people who recognized that certain things didn't require elaboration. He drove back to Charleston in the dark, stopped at a drive-thru because he hadn't eaten since noon, and ate French fries in the parking lot of the Meridian Hotel at 10:30 p.m. because that was where he happened to stop. He sat in the truck for a while after the fries were gone. He thought about Kara finishing a report at the kitchen table while he cooked dinner, annotating her own notes in the margins with questions for herself, the pen moving fast and sideways. He thought about her saying this one goes higher with the particular tone she had for cases that had weight. He thought about Patricia Osei keeping a folder for 3 years because she believed, even without certainty, that it was worth keeping. He thought about Noah, asleep in the apartment 6 blocks away, dreaming whatever he dreamed about on the nights he didn't have the hard ones. He thought about Avery in a boardroom in 3 weeks, walking in with everything, walking in knowing. He started the truck and drove home. The week before the board meeting was the longest week. The documentation was complete. Weatherby had confirmed the federal case was formally opened, which meant the evidence was locked in a chain of custody that Vincent could not touch, and which also meant that when Avery walked into that boardroom, she would have the weight of a federal investigation behind her, not just her own records. But formally opened was not publicly known. Not yet. The investigation was sealed. Vincent didn't know. Landon knew he didn't know because Avery was in contact with him daily, Routine contact, the ordinary operational traffic of a company running its business. And she reported back each night with the same update. Nothing unusual. He was planning travel. He'd asked about a holiday lunch venue for the executive team. He had complained mildly about a third-quarter logistics delay in the way that he complained about most things, fluently, with plausible concern, as a man who was simply doing his job. He sent me an article, Avery said, on the Wednesday before the board meeting, a Harvard Business Review piece about succession planning in family businesses, with a note that said he thought it raised some interesting questions we should discuss. Landon was quiet for a moment. That's a move. Yes. He's planting a seed. If something comes later that challenges your leadership, he's already set up a context. I know. Her voice had the flat quality it had when she was carrying weight. He's been thinking about something. I don't know exactly what, but he's been thinking. Does he have reason to think the board is shaky? Harrington. He's been on the board 14 years, and he's been not unfriendly, but careful with me since the press conference. Vincent has been cultivating Harrington for years. She paused. There's also a newer member, Castillo, who Vincent brought in as a recommendation 2 years ago. So potentially 2 in his pocket. Potentially, I don't know how deep. The board is 12 members? 12, including me. I need 7 to hold any motion. If he moves a vote of no confidence, which is the nuclear option, but if he's scared enough, I need 7 to hold. Where are the other 9? 7 are solid. I've built relationships over 4 years, and I'm not my father. I've done the work myself, not through Vincent. 2 I'm uncertain about. She paused. Harrington and Castillo. 12 hours, he said. What? That's how long you have in the boardroom before a resolution requires a break. In 12 hours, you can present everything, give them time to review, and hold a vote before anyone has a chance to regroup and organize opposition. He paused. You go incomplete, you don't give him a night to work the phone. A long silence on the line. I've been thinking the same thing, she said quietly. When I say it, it feels like a lot. It is a lot. I've never done anything like this before. No, he said. But you've done the thing that makes it possible, which is the harder part. The boardroom is just a room. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, something more wry. You are very good at making things sound manageable. It's a useful skill for a facilities manager. This time she did laugh, briefly, and it was the real one, not the professional version, the reflex version. He'd heard the difference enough times now to know which was which. The night before the board meeting, she called at 11 p.m. I can't sleep, she said without preamble. I know. How do you know? Because I can't either, he said honestly. A pause. What do you do with it? Usually I check on Noah and then sit in the kitchen and make bad decisions about whether coffee is a good idea at midnight. Is it? No, I always make it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her environment, the particular silence of her apartment, which he'd been to once, briefly, to drop off documents, and which was the kind of place that looked like a magazine but felt slightly cold, too much space for one person. Landon, she said. Yeah. When you were an investigator, when you'd built a case and the thing you'd been working toward was finally the next day, what did you think about the night before? He thought about it honestly. I thought about all the things that could still go wrong, he said. I made a list of them and went through each one and figured out what I'd do if it happened. Did that help? Not really, but it gave me something to do with the anxiety instead of just sitting in it. What's on your list tonight? She asked. Vincent attempts a procedural challenge to the meeting itself. Jurisdiction of the call, quorum rules. We've checked. The call is clean. He paused. Vincent makes an emotional appeal to loyalty before the evidence lands. You counter by presenting evidence before argument. He tries to discredit the source, she said, picking up the thread. The federal investigation isn't public yet, so he doesn't know about Farrow or Weatherby. He'll go after the internal records. And the internal records are time-stamped, archived, and corroborated by Patricia's folder and Kara's notebooks. He can't challenge all three. Harrington, she said. Harrington's been on that board for 14 years. If the evidence is in front of him, he's not going to throw his professional reputation behind a man who used the company as a personal account. You hope. I think, he said. I can't know. She was quiet. Avery, he said, you know what you know. You've built it correctly, and you've been careful, and the evidence is real. Tomorrow, you walk into that room, and you show them what's real. The rest of it, how they receive it, what Vincent does, whether Harrington holds, you can't control. You can only control what you put in front of them. A pause. I know, she said. I know that. Another pause. It's easier to know when someone else says it. He understood that. He'd spent 4 years in a version of it. The difference between understanding something in your own head and hearing it in a voice that belongs to another actual person, separate from you, who can hold the weight of it on their side while you hold it on yours. Get some sleep, he said. Whatever you can get. Same to you. Avery. He stopped. Yeah? He almost said something else. He chose not to, because the timing was wrong, and the next 24 hours required her to be sharp and whole and focused on the thing in front of her, not on anything complicated between them that wasn't the right conversation to have the night before. You're ready, he said. She took a breath. Okay, she said. Okay. They said goodnight. He sat in the kitchen. He made coffee. He stared at it. He thought about Kara at the kitchen table, annotating her own notes with questions for herself. He thought about a question mark next to a name that had gotten away with it for a long time. Tomorrow, it stopped getting away. He drank the coffee. He didn't sleep until 2 a.m., and when he did, he dreamed about nothing in particular, which was, all things considered, the best available option for the night before a day like the one that was coming. The board meeting was called for 9 a.m. At 8:45, Avery Kensington walked through the lobby of the Kensington Maritime Building with Margot at her side, a document case in her hand, and an attorney named Claire Shen, small, formidably precise, referred by Farrow, 2 steps behind her. She pressed the elevator button for the 28th floor. She wore the room's temperature. She always wore the room's temperature. Today, she was also going to change it. The elevator doors opened. She walked out. Down the hall, through the glass walls of the main conference room, she could already see board members taking their seats. She could see the silver of Vincent Caldwell's hair as he spoke to someone, relaxed and easy, the way he was always relaxed and easy, the practiced comfort of a man who believed he was still safe. She stopped at the conference room door. Margot was beside her. Margot looked at her once, briefly, with the expression of someone who has worked alongside a person for 11 years and does not need words for what they want to say. Avery opened the door and walked in. The conference room on the 28th floor had 12 chairs around a table that had been in the Kensington building since Raymond Kensington had it commissioned in 1989. Solid mahogany, the kind of furniture that was meant to outlast the people sitting around it. Avery had always had a complicated relationship with that table. It represented permanence, which she needed, and history, which sometimes felt like a weight rather than a foundation. Today she needed it to be a foundation. She set her document case down at the head of the table and looked at the room. 10 of the 12 board members were already seated. Harrington was at the far end, silver-haired and careful, already watching her with the particular attention of a man who had noticed the attorney and was recalibrating. Castillo was 2 seats to his left, younger, less readable. The others, 7 who were solid, whose faces she knew in the way you know the faces of people who have shown up when it mattered, looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity. Vincent was to her right, 3 seats down. He had a leather portfolio in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he was speaking quietly to the member beside him. And he looked, as he always looked, like a man entirely at home. He looked up when she sat down. Avery, he smiled, the collegial smile, the one he'd given her father 100 times. Unusual time for a full session. Everything all right? We'll get into it, she said. Margot closed the conference room door. Claire Shen sat against the wall off to the side with her own document case on her lap, in the particular stillness of an attorney who is ready and does not need to announce it. The 12th board member arrived at 9:02, apologetic about traffic, and took his seat. The room settled. Avery stood. She had prepared remarks. She did not use them. She had decided somewhere around 1 in the morning that prepared remarks had the wrong texture for what this room needed. Too formal, too managed, too much the shape of something rehearsed. The evidence was going to speak for itself. What she needed to do first was make the room understand why it mattered. "I want to start by talking about my grandfather," she said. The room stilled slightly. It was not what anyone had expected, and the unexpectedness of it created a specific kind of attention, genuine rather than polite. Elias Kensington built this company on the principle that your name was only worth what you were willing to stand behind. She looked around the table. He used to say that the shipping industry was built on trust above everything else. You couldn't put your cargo on someone else's ship if you didn't trust the ship. You couldn't trust the ship if you didn't trust the company. And you couldn't trust the company if the people running it were willing to let other things matter more than that trust. She paused. "I've spent the last several weeks reviewing financial records from the last 6 years of this company's operations. What I found, what I am going to show you today, represents a significant and deliberate breach of everything this company was built on." She reached into the document case. "And I want you to understand before I show you a single document that I am not here to protect anyone's comfort, including my own. I'm here because my grandfather's company deserves the truth." She put the first document on the table. The room changed. She could feel it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way temperature changes in a room when something real enters it. Board members leaned forward. Harrington's expression shifted by a degree she measured and filed. Vincent had gone very still. She walked them through it in order. Vendor registration records first. The split payments, the threshold manipulation, the timing. She had printed everything cleanly, organized in sequence, with a one-page summary at the front of each section that stated the relevant facts without editorializing. Margot distributed the packets as Avery spoke. "These vendor accounts were set up to route payments below the internal audit trigger," she said. "Over 6 years, the same methodology, the same authorization pathway." She pointed to the authorization column on the summary sheet. "The authorization chain terminates consistently in the same division." The room was quiet. Members were reading. "This is an internal audit matter," Vincent said. His voice was measured, controlled. The voice of a man who had decided, Landon had predicted correctly, to move immediately to framing. "Avery, these kinds of discrepancies, they occur. They get reviewed. They're not appropriate for a full board presentation without going through the audit committee first." "They went through the audit committee," Avery said, "when you chaired its restructuring 18 months ago. The audit function was rebuilt at your recommendation with a team lead you approved during the exact period these records cover." A beat of silence. "That's a significant implication," Vincent said. "I have the restructuring documents," Avery said. They're in section 3. She watched him. She watched his face do the thing that faces do when a man who is accustomed to managing situations realizes that this particular situation has been built around him. It was not a dramatic crack. Nothing in Vincent Caldwell cracked dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But something in his stillness shifted, from the stillness of a man who is confident to the stillness of a man who is thinking fast. "I'd like to address," he began. "I'd like to finish," Avery said. Not loudly, just with the full authority of the head of the table, which was where she was sitting and where she intended to remain. "There's more." She put the second set of documents on the table. The Port Authority records, Patricia Osei's folder, now formally entered into evidence in a federal case, but with copies legally shareable in an internal board context, as Claire Shen had confirmed. The ghost account. The vendor authorization bypass. The access logs with the deactivated account number that Weatherby's team had traced and confirmed. "These records come from a separate investigation," Avery said. "A Port Authority compliance review from 3 years ago, conducted by an official whose findings were suppressed and whose contract was subsequently not renewed." She paused. "The same vendor methodology, the same authorization bypass, the same account credentials." She looked at Vincent directly. "Your account credentials," she said. "A deactivated account that was kept live in the Port Authority system and used to flag vendors for bypassed verification. The account traces back to your industry registration from 9 years ago, when Kensington Maritime and the Port Authority operated under a shared vendor database. The room was very quiet. Vincent looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at them the way you look at something when you're deciding what it's possible to say. These records are... This is incomplete information, he said. An account with my name attached doesn't mean... Vincent! Harrington's voice from the far end of the table. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough to recognize what he's looking at. Let her finish. Something passed across Vincent's face. Very brief. Avery finished. She put the third section on the table, the federal case. She did not distribute these because active federal investigation documents had parameters around them, but Claire Shen stood and addressed the room for 4 minutes in the flat, precise language of someone who has chosen every word. The investigation was formally opened, the evidence was in federal custody, the scope included both the company records and the Port Authority records, and cooperation with the investigation was in the company's interest and the interest of every member of the board. When Claire sat down, the room was still. Castillo, the newer board member, the one Avery had flagged as uncertain, had not looked at Vincent once since the Port Authority documents landed on the table. He was reading the summary sheets with the focused attention of a man who had recently realized he did not know everything he should have known about who recommended him for this seat. Harrington was the one who spoke. Vincent, he said, not accusatory, just direct, in the way of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when the room has changed. Is there anything you want to say that these documents don't already say? A long silence. Vincent Caldwell had spent 22 years in this building. He had sat at this table for 19 of those years. He had known Raymond Kensington at his strongest and held his daughter's hand in a hospital waiting room when Raymond was at his most broken. He had been trusted, genuinely trusted, by people who deserved better. He looked at Avery. She looked back at him. She was not angry, she had expected anger, had felt it in flashes over the past 3 weeks, hot and real, but sitting here now, looking at him, what she felt was something colder and more final. Not hatred, just the complete withdrawal of something she had given him for years without examining whether he'd earned it. I built a significant part of this company, he said finally. His voice was still even, still controlled, but there was something in it that had not been there before. A very slight thinning, like a wire that has been carrying too much current for too long. You did, Avery said, and you used what you built to take from it for 6 years. Avery, I am not going to debate the documents with you, she said. The documents are in federal custody. The debate has a different venue. Another silence. Harrington looked at the room. He looked at Vincent. He looked at his own hands for a moment, which was the only external indication that this was costing him something. 14 years of professional proximity to a man he had trusted, walking out of the room differently than it had walked in. I'd like to propose, Harrington said slowly, that the board move to a formal vote on the matter of Vincent Caldwell's continued role with this company, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. He paused. In my view, the evidence presented today is sufficient for the board to act. Seconded, said a member across the table. Then another. Vincent said, You don't have to do this in session. I'd like the opportunity to respond formally with my own counsel. You'll have that opportunity, Claire Shen said from her seat against the wall. With federal investigators. I'd like to table the... Vincent. Harrington again. Still not unkind, but final. It's done. The vote was 9-2. Harrington voted yes. Castillo, to his own apparent relief, voted yes. The two who voted no were older members who had known Vincent longest, and even they did not look like men who believed what they were voting. They looked like men honoring an old debt while knowing the debt was no longer worth honoring. Vincent Caldwell sat at the mahogany table for a moment after the vote was announced, looking at nothing in particular. Then he stood, picked up his leather portfolio, and walked out of the conference room without speaking. The room exhaled. Avery sat down. She had been standing for 2 hours, and she had not entirely noticed until now, when her legs felt it all at once. She sat down at the head of the table, her grandfather's table, commissioned in 1989, built to outlast the people around it, and she put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Margot brought her a glass of water and put it in front of her without a word. The board members were talking, some to each other, some on phones, the room already shifting into the mode of people who have witnessed something significant and are beginning to process what it means for everything downstream. Harrington came around the table and stood across from her. He looked older than he had at the start of the meeting, in the way that honest reckonings age people. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been cautious. Since the press conference, I let it affect my read of things it shouldn't have affected." "You voted correctly today," she said. "I should have been less susceptible to—" He stopped. "You trusted someone for a long time," she said. "That's not a character flaw. He relied on it being hard to undo." Harrington looked at her for a moment. "Your grandfather would have handled it exactly like this," he said. "Evidence first, then the vote." "My grandfather taught me that." He nodded once and went back to his end of the table. Claire Shen was beside Avery's shoulder. "Weatherby's team will be in contact this week. The formal resignation and surrender of credentials will need to happen through them. There's a process." She paused. "You should expect this to become public within a few days of the formal charges. You'll want a communication strategy." "Margot," Avery said. "Already on it," Margot said from 2 feet away. Avery sat for another moment. The room continued its business around her. She let it. She thought about her father in a hospital bed, unable to move his left side, trusting Vincent to hold things together. She thought about what it had cost Raymond Kensington to need help, and what that man had done with the trust that cost. She thought about Kara Pierce's notebook and the question mark that had become an answer. She took out her phone. She typed, "It's done. He's out." The reply came back in 45 seconds. "How are you?" She looked at the question. It was such a simple question. Nobody had asked her that today, in the 2 hours she'd been in this room doing the hardest professional thing she'd ever done. They'd asked about evidence and process and what came next, which was reasonable and necessary, but nobody had just asked how she was. She typed, "I don't know yet. Ask me in an hour." His reply, "I'll ask you in an hour." She put the phone in her pocket and stood up and got back to work. The hour passed the way the hours after significant things pass. Simultaneously too fast and strangely hollow, filled with necessary action that keeps the hands busy while the interior catches up. Calls with the legal team. A conversation with the communications director, who had been kept in limited confidence and now needed the full picture. A brief, difficult call with her father's caregiving team, because Raymond Kensington deserved to be told before the story became public, and telling him was going to be the hardest conversation of the day. She made that call from her office, alone, the door closed. Her father's speech was slow. The stroke had taken some of the fluency, not the understanding, and he listened without interrupting while she told him. When she finished, the line was quiet for long enough that she thought she might need to repeat herself. Then Raymond Kensington said, in the careful syllables he worked with now, "You have proof." "Yes, Dad. Federal investigators have everything." Another pause. I trusted him." "I know. I should have—" He stopped, started again. "I was careful. I thought I was careful." He was careful too. He spent 22 years being careful. She held the phone. "This isn't about what you missed. This is about what we found." A long quiet. "Your grandfather," Raymond said finally, slowly, "would say, 'The company stands.'" "The company stands," she said. "I made sure of it." She could hear his breathing. She had learned to read her father's breathing since the stroke, when it was labored, when it was steady, when it was the particular rhythm of someone doing the internal work of holding themselves together. It was steady. "Good girl," he said, and then, "Good woman." She sat with that for a moment after the call ended, just sat with it, in her office, with the harbor through the window and the light doing the thing it did in the late afternoon in Charleston, going sideways in gold. Then she called Landon. It had been an hour and 12 minutes. He picked up on the second ring. "How are you?" he asked, exactly as he'd said he would. "Tired," she said. "And I don't know. There isn't a word for what comes after something like this. Everything feels very loud and very quiet at the same time." Yeah, he said. I know that feeling. She believed that he did. She believed that he had been living in a longer version of it for 4 years. And the understanding of that, the specificity of it, the fact that she was talking to someone who wasn't just trying to be empathetic but who had actually lived there, was the thing that made her exhale. My father said, "Good woman," she said, a beat. He's right, Landon said. She looked at the harbor. A container ship was moving slowly through the channel, its navigation lights coming on as the daylight softened. One of theirs, probably. She'd check the manifest later out of habit because she always checked the manifests. "The beach," she said. "You said Noah's been asking." "Every 3 days, approximately." "This weekend," she said. If that's okay. I'd like to go." A pause. Not uncertain, just present, the way his pauses were always present. "Yeah," he said. "That's okay." The federal investigation moved with the methodical momentum of a process that is well built and well documented and does not need to be rushed because the evidence is not going anywhere. Vincent Caldwell surrendered his credentials and was formally charged 6 days after the board meeting. The charges were substantial: wire fraud, financial fraud, abuse of corporate authority, conspiracy, and they were supported by a document record that 3 attorneys and 2 federal investigators had spent the intervening period reviewing and confirming. The story became public on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it was in every financial publication and several general news outlets, and the shape of the coverage was, for the most part, what Avery had prepared for: the corruption story, the scale of it, the 22 years. Some outlets ran it with pictures of Vincent, some with pictures of the building, one with a split photograph of Avery and her father that felt gratuitous but was inevitable. What Avery had not entirely prepared for was the other thread of coverage, the one that emerged by Friday afternoon and which several outlets ran with varying degrees of accuracy and some notable gaps. The story of the federal investigator's wife who had started pulling this thread years ago. The story of a dead woman's notebooks finding their way, 4 years later, to the right desk. That story got told with the particular sensitivity of journalists who understood that it had weight and were trying, not always successfully, to treat it correctly. Some of them got it wrong in ways that were frustrating but survivable. A few got it right in a way that made Landon sit at his kitchen table on Friday night, reading on his phone, with a feeling he couldn't fully name, something between grief and something that was not grief, something that sat closer to the ground than either pain or relief, and felt, in a way he'd stopped expecting, like resolution. He put the phone down and looked at the refrigerator. Noah's drawing was still there. The beach, the ocean correctly blue, the 2 figures. It had been there since before the Savannah trip, before the Augusta diner, before the board meeting, through all of it. Just a drawing on a refrigerator, made by a 5-year-old who had been working out something about the world in colored pencil. He thought about Kara. He didn't do the thing he sometimes did, which was try to imagine what she would say. He'd found, over time, that imagining what dead people would say was a way of managing grief that created its own problems. It put words in mouths that could no longer choose their own words, and it was too easy to make them say what you needed rather than what was true. He just thought about her, the real her, specific and imperfect, and so thoroughly alive in his memory that the absence was sometimes still physically disorienting, 4 years later. She had been on to something. She had been 3 months in and she had known it went high, and she had been careful. She had been careful, and it hadn't been enough. But not because of the case. The case had nothing to do with why she was gone. The arrhythmia had nothing to do with the case. That was the thing he'd had to learn to hold, the thing that had taken the longest. That her death was not because of what she was doing. It was simply, terribly, a thing that happened. But what she'd been doing mattered. It had always mattered, and now it had mattered in a way that moved through the world. Through Pharaoh's phone calls and Weatherby's custody chain and a boardroom in Charleston and a man named Vincent Caldwell who was going to spend a portion of his remaining years in federal proceedings. She was good, Landon. She was one of the best I had. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then Noah appeared from the hallway in dinosaur pajamas, rubbing one eye, the triceratops dragging on the floor. "Dad, it's late." "It is. You should sleep." "I know." Noah patted over and looked at him with the direct, unvarnished assessment he brought to most situations. "Are you sad?" Landon looked at his son. A little, he said honestly. Not the bad kind. Noah considered this. Like when something is over but it was also good? He looked at the boy, 5 years old, with his mother's capacity for the exact right question, and he felt something move through his chest that he didn't try to name. Yeah, he said, exactly like that. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied with this as an explanation of the human condition. He held out the Triceratops. You can hold Terry if you want. He's good for the not bad sad. Landon took the Triceratops. It was worn at the horns from being carried and clearly beloved, which was the best thing a stuffed animal could be. Thanks, bud. Don't stay up too late, Noah said, with the authority of someone who had heard this said to himself enough times to know it was important, and went back to bed. Landon sat at the kitchen table with a plastic Triceratops in his hand, and the quiet of the apartment around him, and the knowledge that tomorrow they were going to the beach. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays in late October arrive in Charleston, clear and a little sharp at the edges, the kind of day that feels borrowed from summer's end, the light coming in sideways and honest. Landon made eggs. Noah ate them in the focused way he ate things he liked. The tide pool book open beside his plate because the tide pool book had become a permanent feature of mealtimes. Will there be tide pools today? There might be, if we find the right spot. I told Avery about the right spots. Noah looked up. The places where the water gets trapped behind rocks. That's where they are. Good. You can show her. Noah returned to his eggs with the satisfied expression of someone who has a role and is prepared for it. Avery arrived at 9:15 in her car, dressed practically for once, jeans, boots, a jacket that was nice but not expensive nice, the kind of thing a person wears when they've decided to just be somewhere instead of representing something. She had a bag over one shoulder and she looked tired in the way that follows a week of significant events, but the particular tightness that had been around her eyes for the past month had loosened. Noah was out the door before Landon had fully opened it. Did you look up the tide pools? Noah asked her, without preamble. I did, she said. I found a study about intertidal zones on the South Carolina coast. Noah's eyes went wide. There's a study? Several, actually. Do they say where the best spots are? They give coordinates, she said, but I figured you probably already knew better than the scientists. Noah looked at her with an expression of profound appreciation. I've been researching, he said gravely. I know. Your dad told me. Noah looked at Landon with a brief expression that clearly communicated both surprise and approval that his research had been discussed at the adult level, and then turned back to Avery. We should go before the tide comes in. Then let's go, she said. They drove to a stretch of coast that Landon knew, not the tourist beach, not the managed shoreline with the parking infrastructure and the weekend crowds, but a quieter section a little further south where the rocks came down to the water and the pools formed at low tide in the basalt shelves. He had been here with Kara once, before Noah, before everything, on a morning so cold they'd both regretted the idea and been glad of it anyway. He hadn't been back since. He stood on the rocks while Avery and Noah moved ahead toward the water, Noah narrating in the continuous broadcast mode he used for things that mattered. Avery walking beside him listening the way she listened to things she was genuinely interested in, not politely, not with the performed attention of an adult humoring a child, but actually listening, bending down when Noah pointed at something, asking the kind of follow-up question that told Noah his answer had been received. The ocean was gray-green and restless. The light was doing the sideways October thing, making everything look slightly more real than usual. The rocks dark, and the water catching whatever sun got through the clouds. Noah found the first tide pool and crouched over it with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Look, he said. Hermit crab. There. See the shell moving? Avery crouched beside him. I see it. They carry their house with them, Noah said. So they're never without shelter. He looked up at her. I think that's smart. I think so too, she said. Landon stood back and watched them for a moment. His kid and this woman crouched over a tidal pool on an October morning in South Carolina, talking about hermit crabs with equal seriousness. He thought about the press conference, the chandelier, the 12 feet of air between them, the words that had moved through it. He thought about the conference room at the Meridian, the folded copy of the restoration specs. He thought about the kitchen table at 11 p.m. and the notebook in the document case and a diner in Augusta and a boat that never left its slip and a boardroom where the truth finally had enough room to stand up. He thought about how none of it had been clean or simple or the way stories were supposed to go and how that was probably why it had been real. He walked down to the rocks. "Dad," Noah said without looking up, "there's 3 hermit crabs in this one pool. I'm going to count the species." "Okay." "This could take a while." "Take your time." Noah began his species assessment with the thoroughness of someone who takes data seriously. Avery straightened up and stood beside Landon, looking at the water. "I called the Savannah supplier yesterday," she said. "For the Meridian. There are 2 more original fixtures in the renovation scope that need period-appropriate hardware." He looked at her sideways. "Is that a professional update?" "It's context," she said. "I wanted you to know the project is continuing." "I figured it was continuing. I also—" She paused, looking at the water. "I've been thinking about what comes next. For the company, there are real structural things to fix. The audit function, the vendor verification process, the authorization protocols. Things that should have been fixed before, that weren't because someone had reasons to keep them unfixed." "That'll take time," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. A wave came in and fell back. "I'm also thinking about the people who worked adjacent to Vincent's division for years without knowing. The account manager who left, the auditors who were replaced. They were either pressured out or kept in the dark. And either way, the company has an obligation there." "You're thinking about Patricia Osei," he said, "and others like her." She looked at him. "People who saw something and said something and paid for it." He nodded. "She's good at what she does," Avery said. "Maritime compliance and vendor verification, which is now the exact area where my company has significant gaps." She paused. "I've asked Margot to reach out to her, unofficially, to see if there's a conversation to have." He looked at her. "You're offering her a job." "I'm having a conversation," Avery said with the slight precision of someone who understands the difference. "But, yes." He looked back at the water. A pelican moved low over the surface 50 yards out, banking into the wind with the efficiency of something that had been doing this for a very long time and had no patience for unnecessary motion. "That's a good thing to do," he said. "I'm working on doing more good things." She said it simply, without the self-consciousness it might have carried a few months ago. "I'm aware I had some catching up to do." He said nothing. The wind moved between them. "Landon." She was still looking at the water. "Yeah. I've been thinking about what I said at the press conference." She stopped, reorganized. "Not to explain it or justify it. I know what I said and why I said it, and some of it came from things I've been carrying since I was a kid. Ideas about what a life was supposed to look like that I accepted without examining." She looked at him. "I'm not that person anymore. I was already becoming less her before any of this happened, but I'm not her." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I wanted to say it directly," she said, "without it being about the press coverage or the PR situation or any of the noise around it. Just, I was wrong. And I want you to know that I know that, and not because the world told me so." He held her gaze for a moment. The wind was coming off the water, cold and direct. "The man on the ladder," he said, "wasn't looking for an apology." "I know," she said. "He was just doing his job." Something in her expression was quiet and settled in a way he hadn't seen before. "But the man at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, going through records with me, he deserves to hear it." The ocean moved. Noah was several feet away, entirely absorbed in his species count, narrating quietly to himself. The rocks were wet under their feet. The light was doing the October thing. Landon looked at Avery Kensington, the woman who had announced to a room full of cameras that she would never build a future with a man like him, and who had then spent 3 months building something with him, real and useful and complicated and nothing like a future was supposed to look in the version she'd once carried. And he thought about the specific, irreducible truth of people, that they were not what they said they were in any single moment, that they were what they became over time, what they did with the information that arrived and changed them. He had changed. She had changed. Noah, in his own way, was always changing, growing and learning and adding to his understanding of the world one tide pool at a time. Nobody was who they had been at the beginning. "Okay," he said, the same word he'd said in that first Meridian conference room, the first time she'd tried to tell him something real. She looked at him. "Okay?" "Yeah." He reached over and put his hand on the rock ledge beside hers. Not a gesture, not a declaration, just proximity. The specific warmth of one person close enough to another that the distance collapses by a few degrees. "Okay." She looked at his hand. She looked at the water. She put her hand over his. Neither of them made it into more than it was. It was enough as it was. "Dad!" Noah's voice urgent with discovery. "Dad, there's a sea anemone. Come look. You have to come look right now. It's really important." Landon looked at Avery. She was almost smiling. The real one, not the reflex. "Go," she said. "I'll be right there." He went to see the sea anemone, which Noah had been waiting to find since the tide pool book first mentioned them, and which was, he confirmed, exactly as significant as Noah believed it to be. Avery followed a moment later and crouched beside them. The three of them looked at the small, improbable creature in its pool of trapped water, opening and closing its soft arms against the current it couldn't feel, doing the thing it was built to do, alive in the way that things are alive when they find the right conditions. "It's waiting," Noah said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this. "When the tide comes in, it opens up, because then the ocean brings it what it needs." Avery looked at the anemone. "That's patient," she said. "It's just how it works," Noah said. "You can't rush the tide." Landon looked at his son. This specific, remarkable, sometimes exhausting, entirely necessary person who had gotten him through the years when getting through was the only available option, and who had now apparently also become the kind of person who delivered philosophical observations about marine invertebrates on Saturday mornings. "No," he said, "you can't rush the tide." They stayed at the rocks until early afternoon, until the tide started coming in and the pools began to fill, and Noah had documented what he considered a comprehensive species survey that he announced would need a follow-up visit to verify. They drove back north, with Noah falling asleep in the back seat 20 minutes from the city, the Triceratops under his arm, the tide pool book open in his lap to a page about sea stars. Avery followed them in her car. When they pulled up to the apartment building, she got out and stood on the sidewalk while Landon carefully extracted a sleeping Noah, an operation that required the specific combination of physical steadiness and absolute quiet that single parents develop out of necessity. He got Noah onto his shoulder. The boy made a small sound and then settled, deeply asleep, in the way children sleep after a morning of serious outdoor research. Avery looked at them both. "Go," she said quietly. "I'll talk to you later." "Yeah," he said. She reached out and, briefly, touched the back of Noah's hand where it was curled against Landon's shoulder. Just that. A light contact. A small thing. Noah didn't wake up. She stepped back. He carried his son inside, up the stairs, through the door that Noah had left slightly ajar that morning in his rush to get to the beach, and laid him on the bed with the Triceratops and pulled the blanket up. He stood there for a moment in the afternoon quiet. He thought about how long it had taken to get here. Not the beach, not today, but here in the larger sense. The place where things were beginning to look like something that had a shape, rather than just a sequence of days that he was managing through. He thought about how he had not rushed toward it and also had not run from it, which might have been the whole of what he'd learned in 4 years. That the only way to get from one place to another was to go through the in-between, and that the in-between had its own value if you let it. He was not the man who had climbed the ladder at the Meridian. He was that man, in the way that you were always who you were. But he was also someone who had let things land differently than he'd been letting them land, and that difference mattered. He went to the kitchen. He made coffee. He looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. The ocean, correctly blue. Outside the window, Charleston was doing what it did. The waterfront busy, the harbor moving, the ordinary machinery of a city going about its Saturday. Somewhere out there, the Margaret Ann was still in its slip, and Pharaoh was probably threatening to take it out. Somewhere out there, Patricia Osei was in Atlanta having perhaps a different kind of week than she'd had in a long time. Somewhere out there, Vincent Caldwell was beginning the process of accounting for 22 years of choices, which was a reckoning that Landon had no particular feeling about beyond the flat, settled conviction that it was correct. He drank his coffee. He thought about Kara, directly, clearly, the way he'd been letting himself think about her since Augusta. He thought about her in the way you think about someone who is gone but not gone, who is present in the specific gravity they left behind, in the boy asleep down the hall, in the notebooks now in federal custody, in the question mark that had become an answer, in the small daily facts of a life she had shaped that was still being lived. He thought about what she would have made of all of it. She would have made, he suspected, something very specific. She would have pulled the thread all the way to the end and documented everything and asked the right questions and pushed until the answer was complete. She would have been thorough. She always was. He finished the coffee. His phone buzzed. A text from Avery. Noah's sea anemone is going in the species log. He texted me the details for the record. He looked at the screen for a moment. He hadn't known Noah had Avery's number. He was going to need to have a conversation about texting etiquette with a 5-year-old, which was not a conversation he had anticipated needing. He typed back, "When did you give him your number, Savannah?" He asked very politely. "He's 5. He was very convincing." He set the phone down and looked at the refrigerator. The beach drawing. The 2 figures, one tall, one small. The ocean between them and the shore and the world they were standing in. He picked up the phone again. "The Meridian chandelier job is wrapping up next week," he typed. "Gerald is going to be insufferable about it. I'll make sure the report to Gerald reflects your impeccable historical accuracy," she wrote back. "It should just say it's right." "It should," she agreed. "That's enough." He looked at that for a moment, the 2 words at the end of her message, which were about a chandelier, and also, in the way that the right words carry more than their surface, about something else. That's enough. It was. It was more than enough. It was against the odds and across the specific complicated wreckage of 2 lives that had been broken in different ways and had found each other in the wreckage and done something real together. It was by any honest accounting a remarkable amount. He put the phone in his pocket. Down the hall, Noah would sleep for another hour, dreaming whatever he dreamed, adding to whatever interior world he was building in those sleeping hours. When he woke up, he would want to talk about sea anemones and mosasaurs, and whether crabs felt things with their whole bodies too. And Landon would sit at the kitchen table with him and answer the questions he could answer and say, "I don't know," for the ones he couldn't, and make dinner because it was Saturday, and Saturday was whatever Noah wanted within the bounds of what was in the refrigerator. An ordinary evening, an ordinary life, the best possible thing. Outside, the harbor light was going gold and lateral, the way it always did in the late afternoon in Charleston, honest and sideways and not particularly interested in being anything other than what it was. The kind of light that didn't need to be beautiful. It just was.